Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Mr. Will, emergency surgery. A nurse came running into the surgeon's office. What happened? Someone was brought in by ambulance. Will was immediately alerted. No, it's a C-section. A woman's in labor. I don't think we're seeing anyone, Mr. Will said in confusion. A house call out of town. It's a remote village. You can't get in or out. They've got a paramedic station there, but they can't manage on their own, explained the nurse. Will leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples tensely. He had a rough idea of what he was talking about. Located in the northern regions of the country, their city was really the only island of civilization for the many worker settlements scattered in the forests. Well, not exactly forests, of course, but often not even normal tarmac roads led to them. You're the only surgeon on site. Would you be willing to help them now? The nurse asked. I could, of course. But then who would help them? Will shrugged. Call someone to take my place, and I'll go to the village. The car's ready. I don't like going to a rundown midwifery center. But what can I do, Will thought as he started to pack everything he needed. He always had a suitcase in his office for such occasions. Mr. Will, the roads are terrible. We'll have to take a helicopter, said the nurse. Oh well, the patient's health comes first, said the pilot. I'm on my way out, Will replied. And diving into the cockpit, he gave the wave and they took to the air. What happened? The pilot asked curiously. I thought we wouldn't have to fly this month. Yes, the patient is pregnant already. She can't give birth. Will shook his head, reading the brief history given to him by the nurse. Twins. Wow, what were they thinking? We should have gone into the hospital a month before the birth. Well, not everyone can afford it. Maybe people didn't even have money to get to town. It's not rich people who live in these towns. These people have everything. Will dismissed it. You and I are on a special order today. Some local businessman called personally, asked the head doctor to allocate me. I don't know why it took so long then. My daughter's pregnant. My son-in-law can't find a place to live. Dad's got the whole region on his ear now. Did you think she could give birth on her own? We're living in the Middle Ages, aren't we? They decided to give birth in the forest. But I guess it wasn't meant to be. It's good that you are so noble, you rushed straight to the rescue, grinned the pilot. By the way, I thought they had a midwifery station there. I've seen it, Will grimaced. A memory came back to him. They'd been there once before, but on a different occasion. It was many years ago, at the very dawn of his career, when rumors about the young surgeon had not yet had time to spread throughout the region. Why can't they do it themselves? Will had asked his mentor, whom he was supposed to be assisting. The medical car stopped near a ramshackle house with gray wood on the outside. Who's going to do the work? There are no specialists. One paramedic, not enough staff. Who would want to go to such a remote area to work on a permanent basis? Yeah, but at least we have some good equipment, Will said, even surprised, looking at the medical wealth hidden behind the doors. It's just a shame the instruments won't do the operation themselves. Father's good then. He lives in the village and keeps his family there, the pilot said, pulling Will out of his memories. The chief doctor said he wasn't happy about it himself. I was briefed him from head to toe before I left. He said he was a respectable patient. I was worried I hadn't sent my daughter to the center in time. I was afraid they wouldn't see to it. They'll do everything themselves. They did, and here she is before the operation. Well, and you were worried, Will said tiredly, handing the second baby in his arms. Oh, thank you. You're just a wizard, aren't you? Said Mr. Andrew, the businessman who had called the doctors to the village. The cesarean was just right. The babies are healthy and Mom just needs to rest and recover. Will nodded. No miracle, just sleight of hand. You shouldn't belittle yourself, Mr. Andrew exclaimed. You saved my daughter. He saved my daughter. That's worth a lot. I didn't ask for you to be sent here for nothing. The fame of the miracle surgeon has spread far beyond the city, and even to other states. Everyone knows about you, Will. Come on, give me credit, Will said, embarrassed. He was not accustomed to receiving honors, continuing to be a modest specialist, just doing his job. The main thing was that the patient was fine and the baby's health was intact. We're never really worried about being thanked and considered a magician. He had done surgeries and seen their consequences more than once. That's why he stopped being nervous or overjoyed a long time ago. "I owe you my life now," the businessman said suddenly, pulling some keys out of his pocket in front of everyone. "This is a present for you, the keys to a house in this village. Come here whenever you want, have a rest, live here. Nature is amazing. Fishing. You'll always be welcome. And I'll bring you back and give you a first-class holiday." "Come on," the surgeon waved his hands. "What gifts? I just did my job, for which I get a salary." "Don't refuse. It's from the bottom of my heart," Mr. Andrew insisted. "This house belongs to you now. I don't throw my word around." "Oh, come on. How can I accept such expensive things?" "Will, I insist." He embarrassedly accepted the keys and then put them in his pocket. It was useless to refuse a gift right now, staying in the emotions of his father and grandfather at the same time. He just wanted to express his gratitude for saving his daughter and grandchildren. "Maybe I really will come fishing someday," Will thought. "This place is really beautiful." Saying goodbye to his hosts, he left the midwife station and headed back to the helicopter. And the village was strangely enchanting, unfolding its beauty before his eyes. Everywhere he looked there was a welcoming forest. The motorway stretched its cover to the horizon. Will felt a sense of peace as he looked at it all, feeling his soul in harmony with this place on the edge of the world. "When were they sending you to the middle of nowhere again?" Emily, Will's wife, asked incredulously. "What can I do?" "It's the job," he shrugged. "You're traveling all over the region and they pay you a regular hospital wage," Emily grumbled unhappily. Will had no sooner crossed the threshold of the house than his wife immediately began to criticize him, expressing her dissatisfaction. "The salary is ordinary, but the patients are grateful," Will jokingly said, pulling out of his pocket the keys he'd been given. "What's this?" "A house in the country, but the nature there, just a delight. For the operation was a gift." Will tried to lighten the mood with a joke. "I wish you'd taken the money." Emily frowned even more. "Tell me, why do we need this wreck? And it's in the middle of nowhere. We can't sell it or rent it out. Even the owners didn't need it. So they sold it to you. And you're happy with it. Now you have to pay taxes on it, that's all." "What kind of a wreck is that?" "It's a normal house in good condition. Come and live in it. It's run by a local businessman. He's got a farm, big enterprise. So I thought I'd show my gratitude." "Oh, you're such a simpleton." Emily Will sighed heavily, not wanting to have any more useless arguments. Emily was always obsessed with money and only thought about how to get more of it. She was constantly dissatisfied, endlessly poisoning their family life with petty quarrels, complaints and attempts to make Will earn money from private services that paid many times more than his salary at the hospital. "Let's talk about this later." "I'm very tired, I'm sleepy," Will said sadly. Sure. Everything's later with you. You're always tired." Would it do any good to be tired? Emily was unstoppable. So Will just walked past her and then disappeared into the bathroom. Will just wanted to wash off the hard day. After all, another tour of duty was coming up soon. "Listen, Will, why don't you take the day off today?" the doctor suddenly said as he entered the office. "Wow, that's generous. Who's going to be on call? Or will you bring Ben back from his day off?" Will said, remembering that his best friend and colleague was also planning to take the day off today. "No, why? They've sent us some trainings. I'll leave Mr. Gregory with them. He'll keep an eye on them and take charge if there's any trouble." "Is it worth it?" Will asked doubtfully. "It's worth it. You're a valuable man. It wouldn't hurt to give you a day off," nodded the head doctor. "Go get some rest, or I may have to fly again tomorrow." "Well, thank you." It would have been foolish to refuse the generous offer any longer. Will changed his clothes, picked up his bag, and rushed home. Maybe he could surprise Emily and treat her to a romantic dinner. They hadn't spent many evenings together lately. Will was staying late at work more and more often, finishing urgent tasks. It doesn't take much to put a person in a good mood, he thought as he got off at his stop. All it takes is a sudden day off. The mood was really great. A lightness spread on his soul, which he had not felt for a long time. "Can I have a bouquet?" Will asked, stopping at the flower stand. "What kind do you want?" The saleswoman smiled. "Just some roses, 7 of them." Will hurried to the entrance, climbed to the right floor, and opened the familiar flat door. "I'm off today." "Can you believe it?" he said cheerfully. Will took off his jacket and wanted to hang it in its usual place, but suddenly he found someone else's coat there. Guests, Will wondered, looking at the man's shoes left in the hallway. Only now he realized that there was soft music playing in the flat and voices coming from the bedroom. And not just any voices. It couldn't be. He wanted to be wrong. Wanted what he'd heard to turn out to be, not what he thought it would be. Will strode into the room, swung the doors open, and saw. "Will, what are you doing?" Emily shrieked, trying to cover her nakedness with the sheet. "Aren't you on duty?" said Ben, Will's best friend and work colleague. "What are you guys doing here?" Will flared up, clutching a bouquet of roses in his fist. "Are you cheating on me?" "With him?" Emily froze for a second. But after a moment, she glared angrily at her husband and even stopped covering herself. "It's your own fault," she shrieked. "Do you think it's easy to be alone all the time, without attention, without affection? I am not iron." "You're a fool," Will shouted. "He's a surgeon just like me. In the same hospital." "Will, let's not be insulting," said Ben, who just pulled his trousers up. "You shut up. You're my best mate." Will was seething with anger. He threw the flowers on the floor, feeling how stupid he looked standing in front of his lovers with them. At least he's promising. Soon he'll be transferred to a private medical center, and he'll be paid much more than you. Emily blurted out angrily. "We've been dating for years. While you were traveling around your villages, I didn't want to have children with you, because I've been in love with someone else for a long time." Will retreated a step, feeling unbearable pain from the words of an unfaithful wife. All this time he dreamed of a normal family, but instead he received only a dirty betrayal. "And this is after all I've done for us," Will thought sorrowfully, unable to utter a word. "Let's not be silly," Ben said carefully. "We're not going to fight teenagers over a woman." "I'm tired," Will whispered. "No, you don't want to get your hands dirty over something like that," Emily said angrily. And she began to shout at Will, shouting insults, and even wanted to throw herself at her ex-husband. But Ben held her in place, ungrateful. "I wasted my best years on you. I'd rather be with anyone than live with a loser like you." The insults came one after another. But Will wasn't listening. He just turned and walked away, not wanting to see the traitor again. "I only married you because my parents insisted. They knew I shouldn't get involved with such a weakling. You can't even throw a proper scandal," was screaming somewhere in Emily's bedroom. Will threw the keys to the door right on the floor. He didn't even want to take the time to pack. His heart, shattered into 1,000 little pieces, shuddered painfully at the mere sight of what had become a haven for the traitor. "I won't be able to use it anyway. I'd rather buy a new one," Will whispered in a colorless voice, leaving everything behind. He took only his jacket and his bag, which contained all his documents and some money. "Don't you dare come back," Emily shouted after him, looking out of the bedroom, not bothering to cover herself, as if to provoke Will with her defiant look. "Don't worry, I'm not coming back. I'm filing for divorce and hopefully I won't see you again," Will replied in an even voice, and he walked out the door, truly intending never to return to the place where he had been stabbed so cruelly in the back. And there was no energy to wait for the lift. Will walked down the stairs, feeling his consciousness sinking into an abyss of despair. The whole world, which he had so carefully collected all these years, had collapsed in an instant, leaving a confused Will among a pile of useless debris. "So much for your day off," said the head doctor, looking at the letter of dismissal. "What happened?" "Caught my wife cheating on me with my best mate." Will shrugged. "I'm sorry. I can't stay in the clinic or the city any longer. It's disgusting." "Okay, I understand. There's no other option," Why don't you just punch him in the face, teach his wife a lesson? It's a shame to lose such a specialist. But the head doctor did not argue further. He silently signed the application and let Will go, without even forcing him to work the prescribed period. "Where am I supposed to go?" muttered the former surgeon, sitting at the bus stop. Out of sight, out of mind. So, I think they say. And he just wanted to disappear, to go somewhere in the middle of nowhere, not to see the city. His hand slipped into his pocket, fumbling for the keys to the cottage in the country, once given by a grateful businessman. Maybe it was time to take advantage of the invitation. "I didn't think you'd come to us with such news," Mr. Andrew shook his head. "So there was no way out," Will said. "Was it worth it to leave everything behind? Your career, your home, your beloved civilization? I'm not ambitious enough to worry about my career. Housing, civilization. I'll leave it to my wife." "Are you generous?" Mr. Andrew raised an eyebrow. "More like stupid." Will leaned back in his chair, involuntarily recalling his recent conversation with Ben. "Don't hang up," the former friend warned him, having finally reached Will from an unfamiliar number. "Remember that thing with the missing medication?" "What do you care about them now?" Will hissed, not wanting to talk to the traitor. "I've got dirt on you, so don't be fooled. I'm serious, but I'm not getting married. I like being with her, though, so get out of town and don't let me or her see you. What else? Maybe you should keep the flat, too. You will, and you will. Otherwise, I'll report you for having a whole ample of accountable substances missing from your department. You'll not only get fired, you'll go to jail." Will, gritting his teeth, didn't understand how Ben had found out about one of the nurses' blunder. The medicine went missing by accident, not by malice aforethought. "That's the only reason I didn't turn the nurse in, so she wouldn't be penalized for anything." "Well done, hero. Except now the situation could come to light. And it's not just you who's going to get hurt. It's the nurse who made the mistake. So you're going to drop everything and leave." "Yeah." "Anyway, the village will welcome you with open arms," came Mr. Andrews' voice, bringing Will out of his dark memories. "What lost?" the former surgeon interjected. "I'm saying we'll always need someone of that caliber. You'll get a job in our paramedic station. You'll be in charge. We will provide you with all the necessary means. We have no problems with them. We're just short of people." "Thank you," Will said. "So there'll be no trouble at all. The villagers will be glad to have a doctor around. It'll be quieter now. Especially as my friend and protege, Mr. Andrew, winked. You can't be kidding. We're supposed to be friends with people like that." "Hello, son. You're as unreachable as the White House now," said Mrs. Torrey, Will's mum. "What are you worried about, Mum?" "We spoke 2 days ago," he said with a tired smile. "Of course I'm worried. That's why I've been calling a lot. My son has gone to the end of the world. If she had known that everything would end like this, she wouldn't have a foot in our house." Don't worry. You need to take care of your nerves." Will tried to distract his mother from the sad subject. "How are you settling in?" "I'm settled. Mr. Andrew helped. The paramedic station where I work now, they've got everything I need. They gave me a good salary. It's a career move." "Oh, I don't like you being in the middle of nowhere," said my mother. "What wilderness is this?" "It's a whole village. Nature again. I go fishing, pick mushrooms. I am surprised myself, but I even like it here. I literally rest my soul." "Can you imagine?" Will replied. "Oh, I don't know, son, I don't know. Maybe it's for the best. Chill out, clear your head. Just don't forget to call some worried sick." Okay, bye, kisses." Will waited until she hung up and put the phone aside. The pain of being stabbed in the heart by an unfaithful wife had not yet subsided, but it was beginning to ease. "Mr. Will, hello. Can I see you?" came the voice of the local gamekeeper. "Of course, Samuel will come in," smiled at the surgeon. He had already spent some time in the village and had got to know almost all the locals. So the people here were quite friendly, and they were eager to establish relations with the only doctor in the neighborhood. "Look, your help is needed, but the request will be a little strange," said Mr. Samuel. The elderly man wiped his feet on the mat and went inside. He sat down in a chair, fingering the hem of his jacket. He clearly didn't know how to start a conversation. "Anyway, I found a wounded wolf here," said the gamekeeper. Wounded? Will asked interestedly. Yeah, they shot at him, but only wounded him in such a cowardly way that they didn't finish him off. I'd fix him up myself, but I can't get the bullet out. I need tools, an aesthetic, and practice. I'm just a laborer, not a doctor. You want me to do it? I know I'm used to treating people, but at its core, it's a living thing too. It's a shame it's just lying there, dying. Will leaned back in his chair, looking intently at Mr. Samuel. It was the first time he had ever made such a request, but it was not his policy to refuse to help a living creature. After a little gathering and wandering through the woods, they came to a small ravine, at the bottom of which the wounded animal lurked. Well, look, there it is, lying there. Poor fellow, said Mr. Samuel. Will it bite? Will questioned the wolf doubtfully. Yes, he's weak, and he knows me. Don't be afraid. Will went down behind the huntsman, laid out the tools he had brought with him, and then took a syringe of anesthetic. Shall we get started? Let me hold his head. Just in case, replied Mr. Samuel, stroking the wolf between the ears. The operation, strangely enough, was a success. In half an hour, Will had already started to put a bandage on the wound. The surgeon easily removed the bullet, treated the wound, and even put in a few stitches. All this time, the wolf lay meekly in their arms, only whimpering and twitching his tail tip restlessly. Good boy, you'll be all right now, Will said, carefully tightening the knot in the bandage. Thanks for your help, said Mr. Samuel. As you can see, the poachers did their best. It's not even meat they're after, it's entertainment. They kill for fun, the bastards. If it wasn't for you, the animal would have died. I'll never forget your help. Will clapped the gamekeeper soothingly on the shoulder. To wait, he said, we did the right thing. There's nothing to be thankful for. After making sure that the wolf would be able to heal the remaining injuries on his own and leaving him some food, the men climbed out of the ravine and headed toward the house. You know, I was thinking of killing it first, Mr. Samuel said, the way he looked at me. Honestly, like a human being, eyes so smart. I was startled, so I thought I'd bother you. He noticed that he had soaked up the local color, that he even began to speak like the villagers. Having come here from despair, he found a real home, which not only sheltered the unhappy wanderer, but also began to gradually heal his ruined life. Are you here to visit again? Will said, noticing the gray silhouette on his property. The wolf muttered something in his own language and dropped the hair carcass from his teeth. Thank you, Will thanked him, picking up the treat. The wolf sat up on his hind legs, nodded, and looked at his savior. It seemed to be thanking him for his help. The wolf had become a local landmark, thanks to the gamekeeper. Everyone already knew the story. No one was afraid of the wolf. He was allowed to run quietly through the streets. I'm just going for mushrooms. Will you walk me? Will turned to his gray acquaintance. The wolf muttered something again, shook his ears, and got up on his paws. Together they headed into the forest. The wolf ran about 5 meters ahead of them, and Will wandered behind, checking out the mushroom patches. They've all been picked, it seems, he said frustratedly after an hour of wandering. We should go further back, to the remote part. The locals don't seem to go there. The wolf seemed to have run off on his own. At least Will hadn't seen its gray back in a long time. It was nice in the forest, not yet cold and pleasant in autumn. It smelled of fallen leaves. You don't see such beauty in the city, Will murmured, wandering along some barely visible path. He had gone quite far from the village, and only now he realized that he was beginning to get confused as the overgrown paths became lost in the grass and familiar landmarks disappeared. I should have got so lost, he muttered restlessly to himself, spinning round and round on the spot. Suddenly there was a familiar grunt. He stopped, then was relieved to see his wolf nearby. Hello, mate, Will said. Will you take me home? I'm lost out here, the wolf mumbled something in response. I'll take that as a yes, thank you. I'd probably be lost if I hadn't seen you. The wolf wagged his tail and ran forward. Will hurried after him, trying not to lose sight of the gray silhouette. Hey, are we sure we're going the right way? He shouted worriedly at the wolf. But the wolf continued to run along the path he alone knew. This part of the forest was completely unfamiliar to Will. If he had been alone, he would have preferred to go to some river, or he would have chosen a landmark, for example, by the sun. But in the company of the beast, he just decided to trust it. "What the hell is that?" Will said in surprise as he wandered through the bushes to a small clearing. After an hour of wandering, he and the wolf came to the wreckage of the downed helicopter. "Hey, is anyone there?" Will shouted, more for the sake of order. The crash had obviously happened a long time ago. The hull of the helicopter was rusted through. The area around it was overgrown with grass, and there was no sign of human presence anywhere. How long had it been since anyone had been here? Will said thoughtfully. Cautiously approaching the wrecked machine, he walked around the hulk, checked that the decking was not collapsing under his weight, and only then looked into the cabin. My God, Will couldn't help his exclamation when he saw the human remains on the front seat. The pilot? The experienced surgeon, though former, had often seen blood, trauma of all kinds, and even internal organs. But to be confronted with the mummified remains of a dead person like this was a first for Will. "Whose helicopter are you?" he said thoughtfully, looking at the interior. And of course it would be hard to find answers now, so many years later. It could have come from the mines, probably disappeared off the radar during an Emercom rescue mission. Mr. Gregory had said something about a plane crashing here many years ago. Will thought. There was no need to comment on anything, but his own voice soothed him. It also attracted the wolf so it wouldn't run away. It was actually kind of creepy to be out here, alone in the middle of an unfamiliar forest, next to a man who died years ago. Will remembered all the stories about ghosts and cursed places he knew. Every rustle made him turn round nervously, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. A chill ran down his spine. "What's that?" he whispered quietly, noticing the cellophane bag. Fighting his inner fears, Will reached out, dangerously close to the dead man, and carefully pulled a document out of a drawer. "Koa," he said as he ripped off the wrapping. It wasn't a piece of paper or an insert at all, but a real photograph of his young mother standing in the arms of a man. "How is that even possible?" Will said with trembling lips. This was too much. He felt his fingers go numb and his heart race. A wolf grunted behind it. You're not a ghost yourself, are you?" Will whispered quietly, squinting at his great companion. The wolf snarled and licked the scar on his side from the surgery. "Okay, I get it, not a ghost," Will exhaled, trying to push away his superstitious fears. As a man of science, he had to always remain above any irrational fantasies. "The strangest thing is that I saw the same picture at home," Will said. Seemingly forgotten memories surfaced before his eyes. "Mum, who is that?" Will asked, twirling in his fingers a picture of a very young Mrs. Torrey standing in the company of a strange boy. "Oh, Will, don't shake those dusty albums," Mum fussed. "Are you hiding something?" said the son jokingly. "It's just something from the past. It doesn't mean anything. I'd forgotten I had it somewhere." "Well, tell me what kind of greeting it is." Will squinted his eyes in suspicion. "Leave me alone." "There's nothing to tell," Mum cut him off, taking the photograph from his hands. He hadn't noticed his mother's strange behavior that day. Every adult had a past that he didn't want to remember. If I'd known I'd run into such a hell of a thing, I'd have asked for it. Will shook his head regretfully, returning his thoughts to reality. Well, it's time to get ready to head back. The sun's going down and visitors aren't welcome in this forest at night. The wolf grumbled in agreement. "Shall we go to the village or go somewhere else?" Since we're on an expedition, the wolf only twitched his ears and wandered back along the path. It took them several hours to get out of the forest. The journey had taken all Will's strength. He could barely move his legs. It was a shame he hadn't picked any mushrooms. If it hadn't been for the strange photo, it would have been a wasted day. "Mr. Samuel, I'm here to see you this time." "May I?" said Will, entering the gamekeeper's hut. Come in, dear. What have you come for?" said the elderly owner in a friendly tone. "Tea with raspberry jam. I made it myself. It's good this year." "Thank you, I wouldn't say no," Will nodded, sitting down at the table. "Remind me, when did you have a helicopter crash here? You told me about it once." "I did," Mr. Samuel replied, setting a mug of tea in front of his guest. "The rescue crews were flying in bad weather, I think. Their pilot was out of control. Have you heard anything more about that accident?" "No," the man shrugged his shoulders. "It's sad, but they crash every now and then. Again, nobody knows where it fell. Specialists searched and searched, but they didn't find anything. I think I found it. Will unfolded the roll the huntsman had given him and began to look at the forest. Even though he was in Wolf's company, he still remembered where they were so he could tell the authorities. The deceased pilot should have been buried, and the property in the form of the crashed helicopter would be a good idea to hand over to the owners. Will looked at the small clearing strewn with wreckage. "What the hell are you doing out there?" Mr. Samuel shook his head. "I was mushrooming. You've got all the mushrooms in the neighborhood." "And did you find a dead body in the pilot's seat?" "In the pilot's seat?" "Yes," exclaimed the gamekeeper, and even crossed himself. "Well, not a corpse, of course, a mummy. Remains. Many years have passed. Okay, I'll call the district now. We need to organize an expedition. Equipment." "Is there even a place to get through?" "It's an overgrown road, but I think you can make it." Will sat for a while, watching the rangers fuss. The deed was done. Now the missing man would finally find peace. Everything seemed right, but there was still a mystery to the mystery. The photo he'd found was literally burning the inside of his jacket pocket. And although Will didn't want to disturb his elderly mother, he needed to find out the truth. "Mr. Samuel called from you," Will asked, waiting for the gamekeeper to calm down a little. "Yes, he did. Only I have long distance. Why?" Nothing. Will dialed a familiar number and listened to the ringing tone, wondering if he'd get his mother home in time. "Hello. Who is this?" Mrs. Torrey's voice came through. "It's me, Mum. Hi. I'm just calling from another number." "Oh, son, is something wrong?" "No, I'm fine. How are you doing? Are you healthy?" "I'm fine." Don't worry. Just tell me one thing." Mrs. Torrey lay silent, listening intently to her son's every word. "Just don't worry, okay? Do you remember that picture of you standing young with some man? Why are you suddenly talking about her?" Mother questioned me warily. "It's just a case. I found a helicopter that crashed. It's been lying there for a long time. Everyone has forgotten about it, but I came across it in the woods and found exactly the same picture of the dead pilot. It's a strange coincidence. Maybe you know him." There were soft sobs in the phone. Mom was trying to hold it together, but it seemed that the news of the pilot's death had upset her. "Is everything okay? What's wrong?" "My son. What happened? Did he crash?" "What are you worried about? That was years ago, not now." "Yes, you're right. It's been a long time." Mrs. Torrey sighed sorrowfully, unable to hold back her sobs. Mum, what happened? Do you know this man?" Will asked cautiously. "It was years ago. You see," Mrs. Torrey exclaimed again. "We had a fight." "With whom, Mum?" "Who was that man?" he asked, sensing something wrong. "It's a photograph. We made 2 copies. Me and your father." Will couldn't believe his ears, and at the same time he felt his heart skip a beat. Dad, Mum never talked about him and never liked to bring him up. He was absent from their lives. She preferred to pretend that he was, so as not to torment herself or little Will. "We had a big fight then." Mrs. Torrey continued her story. "Andrew, your father, was a hot-tempered man with a temper, and he went to work as a lifeguard in places with difficult conditions. Will vividly pictured his dad, driven by strange feelings, leaving the city and going to work in the wilderness to heal his wounded heart. Just like his son 20 years later. Completely unaware of each other, they repeated the same journey." "What happened then? Did you stop talking to each other?" the son asked, anticipating the answer. "I tried to find him, wrote letters, asked colleagues, but it was as if he disappeared." Now I can see where. Mrs. Torrey couldn't stand it any longer and began to cry even harder. Old wounds that had barely healed in her chest had reopened in her old age. So, suddenly bursting into her life with bitter memories, Will was afraid to disturb her, so as not to provoke a nervous attack. But he couldn't deny himself the truth, because the second conversation might not happen. "Why didn't you and Daddy get married?" he said quietly but insistently. "Andrew's parents were against it, son," answered his mother through her tears. "Why?" "He was from a wealthy family, the heir to an illustrious family name. His parents dreamed that their only offspring would follow in the footsteps of their ancestors, also go into business, increase the family capital. Apparently, he wasn't that kind of man. That's right. You two are even more alike than you think. Your dad always wanted to save people, just like you. That's why he joined the emergency services, even though I asked him to. Is that why you two fought? Yeah, I was afraid he'd die on one of his calls. I wanted to keep him safe, but in the end, I just pushed him into the arms of death. Will slumped his shoulders helplessly, realizing that in the abandoned clearing he had most likely found his own father's grave. The corpse at the pilot's seat was hard to identify. The remains were too heavily mummified, but no one else could simply have this ill-fated photograph. Why keep a picture of a woman you don't know? Son, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I just couldn't, Mrs. Torrey sobbed. It's all right. I understand, Will said gravely. I'm sorry to make you remember all this. Take something to calm you down. I'm getting on your nerves with all this questioning. I will. You take care of yourself in there, okay? And let me know if you hear anything. Will said goodbye to his mom and hung up. His heart felt heavy. He'd never known his father, but he secretly hoped to meet him one day. It wasn't some sort of necessity. It was just a childhood fantasy that had been shattered today by the harsh reality. It felt empty. For the first time in his life, Will wanted to get drunk so he wouldn't feel anything. Will, I'm sorry if I accidentally overheard you talking, Mr. Samuel said quietly, sitting down next to him. I'm sorry. It's a family thing. Don't mind me. Yeah, it's not that. I know something's obviously wrong. What do you mean? Will Lil asked tiredly. Well, listen to this. There was only supposed to be one pilot in the helicopter cabin that day. How do you know? Will answered a little irritated. You said it was a long time ago, but the pilot at the base was our local guy. He disappeared after a while, by the way. They say he went to the city. He had no family or parents, so nobody looked hard enough to find him. What do you mean by that? Will exclaimed. That a member of the Ministry of Emergency Situations couldn't have been there, you know? Why not? Dad wasn't a pilot, was he? Right. So he wasn't at the helm of the helicopter. Will stared at the gamekeeper. The older man nodded confidently, showing that he was sure he meant what he said. So there more to come, Will thought, feeling a faint hope inside. How could he refuse so tempting an occasion to hope for a miracle? Suppose you are right, Mr. Samuel, Will said, careful not to spook his luck. But where would I look for my father? He was obviously in that helicopter, or at least had something to do with it. I can't tell you that. Try our neighborhood of Osser. Mr. Michael, you know him. He's a good guy. Thank you, Will thanked Will sincerely, shaking the gamekeeper's hand. What's in it for me? Mr. Samuel waved him off. I wish you well. Will walked out of the hut, excited and at the same time afraid of making a wrong move. Fate had teased him with the discovery, then taken away his hope, then brought it back again in the form of a ghostly chance to find traces of a man who had disappeared 20 years ago. A whole host of feelings were simmering in Will's head, and he had absolutely no idea how to deal with so many emotions at once. He just hoped he wouldn't be disappointed. He hoped he wouldn't be disappointed because the search was going to be difficult, and the outcome of it was going to ease his mind. So look, said Mr. Michael, flicking through the yellow pages. I've done my own little investigation as you asked. I'm sorry to interrupt your work, said Will. Come on, you're the doctor. You're kind of the authority in the village. And the authorities have to help each other out, winked the precinct. Anyway, look, I had to ask around, pull some old strings. In the end, I found out that in the district and the Ministry of Emergency Situations many years ago worked only one person. And so it was my father, Will asked incredulously. I don't know. There are no children listed in his personal papers. You have different surnames. The policeman spread his hands. Maybe there's a photograph of him. Will didn't give up hope. Alas, only an entry in his personal file. Their department had moved several times. Paperwork was moved back and forth. Half of them got lost. You know how messy the government can be. Yes, I know, Will shook his head grimly. It was the only thread that could unravel this tangle. If this trail breaks too, Will began. Don't be in a hurry. The precinct officer was quick to reassure him when he saw the look on his face. There is still an interesting moment in this investigation. What point? Questioned the doctor. The most interesting thing here is that this very man, who worked then in the Ministry of Emergency Situations, is none other than a well-known businessman and local benefactor, Mr. Andrew, said Mr. Michael. Are you sure? It couldn't be more accurate. I've checked several times and came to a definite conclusion. But how could this happen? He's rich. He gave me a house. Why would someone like that ever work as a lifeguard? It pays a pittance. Not everyone is born with a silver spoon in their mouth. Some people have to start at the bottom, from simple laborers. Then they start their own business, make their own money. Ask him yourself. The policeman handed Will a cardboard folder with all the documents he had managed to collect during the investigation. Mr. Andrew, how could he be involved in this? The only hope left was to simply show the photograph found on the plane and see how the businessman reacted. Hello, Mr. Andrew, Will said, entering the businessman's office. He, as always, was in a small administrative building of his firm. Hi, come in. You are always welcome here, the businessman smiled. I have a question for you, but do not consider it tactless. What kind of question? Mr. Andrew raised his eyebrows in surprise. Believe me, it is very important to know why you quit your job in the Ministry of Emergency Situations many years ago, and what happened to that helicopter. Do you have strange interests? Mr. Andrew shook his head. It's been so many years. The thing is, I found that helicopter in a man's body. Now I want to put things right. Why? It's personal, but I promise you, at the end of your story, I'll tell you everything. Well, it sounds like a serious matter for you, at least. Mr. Andrew shook his head. After that helicopter crashed, we never found him. The pilot died either in the crash or in the woods. I was supposed to go with him that day, but I came down with a sore throat. I'd never been sick before, and I couldn't even get out of bed. So that's the only reason he went alone. I thought it was fate or else. A man warned me about this kind of thing. I'm a stubborn donkey. Mr. Andrew's gaze faded into sadness. He was evidently recalling some of the more unpleasant events of his life. Will became alert and strained his hearing. So he quit his job and went into business. I did it all on my own. I had a knack for it, thanks to my parents and teachers when I didn't appreciate it. I started my own business. That's how I built up my own firm. I decided not to leave the Taiga, now that things were getting better. I raised this settlement, and there were 2.5 cripples here before. What about your relatives? Have you been in touch with them? Yes, it's complicated. Mr. Andrew shook his head. It was such a scandal when I left home. It's embarrassing to remember. I slammed the doors and I didn't think about the future at all. That's how everyone thought I was gone, except his parents. But why didn't you try to contact anyone? Will wondered. The doctor had already guessed the true reasons, but he wanted Mr. Andrew to tell everything himself, without prejudice, as in front of a stranger. You see, it's like I've started a new life. I even took my new wife's name so the past wouldn't catch up with me. I thought if fate told me to do it, I should do it. Maybe such a decision seems strange now, but back then I was ashamed to go back. I couldn't admit I was a fool. And it turned out exactly as I'd been warned. Thank you for being honest, Mr. Andrew. One last question, Will said in a trembling voice. Do you know this woman? He took the photograph from his inside pocket with cold fingers and put it on the table in front of the businessman. Of course, wait a minute. Where did you get this picture from? Yeah, it was in the helicopter I found. I left it there by accident. The pilot must have picked it up. Wanted to give it back. Probably couldn't. We looked at Mr. Andrew. Everything was falling into place now. The businessman's reaction was too unambiguous. He hadn't even tried to deny that the photo had once belonged to him. 2 copies. One at my mum's and the other, it turns out. I performed a case-in on my half-sister. Will spoke up, fully realizing what was happening. Wait, but your last name is Smith. Why? Exactly like her parents. So, Mrs. Torrey, your mom gave you a different surname at birth, Mr. Andrew said in a low voice. But why? I can only assume it was because of my parents. They're rich people, obsessed with blood purity. As strange as that sounds in modern times, They wouldn't let them live in peace. They'd take the baby for themselves, or worse. That's why I took my wife's name, so they couldn't find me. But why didn't she write to me that she was pregnant? I did. I tried to find her. There was nowhere to go. She thought you were dead, too, so she couldn't find the end of it. Will shook his head sadly. I ended up growing up without a father and with the wrong surname for me under normal circumstances. That's why you didn't understand anything. Not even when you called me for help from the city. Can you imagine the coincidence? Asking my own son for help and not even knowing it. I'm sorry, Mr. Andrew said quietly. It wasn't your fault. Who could have guessed it would turn out like this? There was still an emptiness in his soul. Will rubbed the bridge of his nose tiredly, not knowing how to react to what had happened. He'd found his father, but the bitterness of the lost years they could have spent together left an unpleasant aftertaste. Maybe we can try to communicate somehow, Mr. Andrew said quietly. It was obvious they were thinking along the same lines. Of course, Will nodded. I didn't ask you last time. Where's your new wife? She died a long time ago. I've been raising my daughter Amanda on my own. Have you seen her? She's all taken care of now, 2 little ones. You've got to be kidding me. She and her son-in-law don't have time to sit down. Look, maybe then. I don't know. If you want to, you could invite your mom over. But you don't want to go yourself, I know. But she really wanted me to let you know as soon as it's clear. I think she deserves to see you alive so she can stop mourning. Sure, call her, have her come visit. He was sighed, anticipating what a difficult conversation he was going to have with his mum. The whole situation continued to seem strange to him, but at least they still had a chance to forgive each other and maybe find some belated happiness. Better late than never. Hello, Mum, Will said that evening, dialing the home number. Yes, hello, son, came the sad voice in the receiver. How are you? I'm fine. I found Daddy. Oh, really, in the helicopter. But at least I'll have proper burial after all these years. He's alive. He wasn't there when he crashed. Only your picture was there, and that was an accident. How is he alive? Mrs. Torrey gasped on the other end of the line. Well, how? It's a confusing story, Will said, hastening to interrupt the inevitable series of questions. Come to us, and you can ask them all about it yourself. Where am I going? It's inconvenient. It's convenient. Dad's inviting you, and you should see him anyway. He's already got his own life there, my mother whispered into the phone. What's the point after all these years? But at least talk to each other. Forgive each other, so you can move on calmly. I need that for me too. I don't want my parents to continue living in a quarrel. Will urged his mother to come over. Will hung up the phone. His heart was beating a familiar rhythm, and autumn continued to fall on his soul. This crazy investigation had reunited his parents and allowed him to find his father. But the big picture wasn't fully coming together. It seemed to be worth rejoicing, but there was one more very important thing to complete, which Will didn't want to put on someone else's shoulders. Well, hello. He smiled as he greeted his mother. Here's our village. It's a nice place, and the people are kind. Son, I missed you so much. Mrs. Torrey threw herself into a hug. Me too, Mum, but you've got more important things to do than me. Will took her under his arms and led her to Mr. Andrew's house, who was already waiting for them on the porch. Hello, Torrey. The businessman said hello to Mr. Andrew. Will's mum froze, unable to believe that she was seeing the first love she had mourned years before. Well, there's no need to introduce you. You're not little kids. You two can talk to each other. I'll be going. Where to? Parents in one voice surprised interrogated. There's something I need to finish. Will turned and walked down the main street without listening to any objections. He had recently been notified as the only contact person in the helicopter crash case. Look, are you sure? Will questioned the precinct officer at the time. It's an unpleasant job. I can do it myself. I'm used to it. No, I'm the one who found it. I'm the one with the bad news. Not a bad bloke. They let him go a long time ago. They've had their grief. They've had their worries. Now they need to give him a proper burial. So it's a good thing. We'll walk slowly to the house of the dead pilot and check the address once again. The house stood a little aside, not far from the village. He knocked on the door. Excuse me, is this where the Swan family lives? Will said. Yes, what is your business? The girl asked, looking boldly at the visitor standing on the doorstep. You seem to be our new doctor. Anything wrong? No, not exactly. You see, here's the thing. Mr. Peter Swan was your father, wasn't he? Yes, but he disappeared when I was very young, nodded. She was pretty with big eyes and a slender figure and hair the color of a raven's wing. Looking at her, Will felt himself blushing and struggled to find the words. The dead pilot's daughter was too pretty. So much so that even Will's worried heart pounded with renewed vigor. A familiar warmth spilled into his chest. I'm sorry to have to tell you that your dad, he died in a helicopter crash far out in the woods. But we found his body. Mr. Swan can now be given a full and proper burial. Mummy, what is it? A child's voice came from inside the house. Nothing, son. It's for me on business, she said in a trembling voice. I'm sorry to be like this, Will mumbled. It's all right. Come in and have some tea. Can you tell me what's going on? My name's Caroline. Will followed her into the house. He didn't know what to say in such cases, so he just told her exactly how he found the helicopter, what investigation followed. It's interesting. You and I both found fathers. One way or another, Caroline shook her head. At least yours is alive. Maybe I can let mine go now. They sat together for a while longer, gradually shifting from sad topics to casual conversation. Will even felt as if they'd known each other for a long time. At least, he wanted to keep in touch with Caroline, to help her in some way, to ease her suffering. What the hell was that? Will grumbled when he heard a strange scraping at the door. It sounded like someone was just clawing at the outside or trying to make a dig. There you go again, Will said, and swung the door open. Seeing the wolf on the threshold, he said, Did you miss me? Will grumbled restlessly. So much has happened. It would take me a long time to tell you. I found my father, met a girl. Will felt the color rise to his cheeks at those words. It had been a few weeks since he and Caroline had met. In that time, the young people had already met several times, gone for walks, and started to spend more and more time together. They felt comfortable talking to each other. Communication was easy, and sympathy is quite mutual. They didn't even want to break up. Like schoolboys, really, Caroline giggled when she returned with Will after another date. We can walk till dawn. It's a little cold, though. But I have a couple of warm jackets, smiled at the doctor. Don't talk. I have a baby at home, Caroline shook her head. And if you think I'm in any way embarrassed by Justin, I don't. Just give us time to figure things out, Caroline said quietly. She stepped almost close to Will and kissed him gently. Their sympathy was slowly growing into something more, and they didn't want to rush things at all. There were too many sad stories under their belt, too scared of their hearts. But one thing each of them knew for sure, this new relationship could turn out to be something truly special for them. The wolf interrupted Will's pleasant memories. What's wrong? You seem a little restless today. The predator spun around a few times, jumped up, and then ran up to Will. The furry mate grabbed him by the hem of his jacket and literally dragged him towards the forest. What's the matter? What's troubling you? Will exclaimed. There was another growl. Okay, I got it. I'm on it. Together they rushed through the forest, winding through wild paths. Soon Will, following the wolf, crossed the familiar part of the forest and headed for the hunting grounds. Help, came a child's voice from behind the bushes. I'm here. So what happened? Replied the doctor, Uncle Help. My leg is stuck, came the cry of Justin, Caroline's son. How did you get here? Will ran up to the child and only now noticed the poacher's trap. A steel teeth sank into the boy's ankle, damaging the skin. The boy's lips turned white and he held on with all his might. It's all right. It's no big deal, Will said in a cheerful voice. We'll fix it. The surgeon gingerly gripped the halves of the trap, tensed and loosened the terrible trap. Oh, it hurts, exclaimed the boy. That's it. Now slowly. Will was frantically thinking about what help could be given now to avoid serious complications. In almost all the wounds looked serious. In addition, there seemed to be a shattered bone, and the boy couldn't even lean on the injured leg. Now look, this is called a tourniquet, Will said, putting a bandage on Justin's thigh. That's how you do it. And the blood started to trickle out of the wounds more slowly. Now we can treat them. Peroxide. Good thing he thought to bring a bag. Will thought, Justin, you're doing great. Now watch. I'm going to put you on my shoulder so I don't hurt your leg. And your job is to hold on so you don't fall, okay? Yes, I'll hold on, answered the boy. Good. Will carefully lifted the little patient and moved towards the village. The wolf had been running in circles around them the whole time, anxiously watching how their two-legged companions were doing. Will, my God, how could it be? Caroline ran into the paramedic station. Shay, don't panic, he replied. They've just landed a helicopter. They're going to take him into town and operate on him. Surgery, Caroline exclaimed. Yes, Justin was caught in a trap. What I was able to do on the ground I repaired, but the wounds are very serious. It's going to take some serious surgery. I just didn't risk doing it here. My poor boy, Caroline sobbed. The mother's heart clenched anxiously, afraid to even imagine what could have happened. Will watched sympathetically as Caroline paced the room. She wanted to rush to follow the helicopter, but realized that space was limited. How can he be in there alone? Caroline muttered. Don't worry, I've got some medical contacts. I know the head doctor there. Dad helped too, paid all the expenses, and booked us a car. We'll follow in a couple of hours. We'll be there by morning, when it should all be over. Caroline leaned into Will's shoulder. Her whole body trembled, but somehow she knew this man would be able to protect them. The thought of hurting the baby was too scary for her. But in her mind, she knew Justin was in good hands, so she decided to trust Will completely. How's it going in here? Will asked, walking into Caroline's house. It's like coming to work, she said, smiling. I can walk on my crutches, and I'll be running again soon. Justin's cheerful voice came from the room. Easy, fighter. Don't be in a hurry. You will definitely run, but not until the bones heal properly, Will smiled. The operation he had arranged for the boy had been a success. Thanks to Will's care, Justin was discharged in a couple of weeks with the condition that he would have a good rehabilitation under the doctor's supervision. Will was now really coming around every day after work, working with the boy. Are you doing all the exercises? Will asked. Sure, Justin replied. Come on, show me. Me. Only two, go ahead, and I'll make dinner, Caroline said. She came up behind him, put her arm around Will's shoulders, and kissed him on the cheek. The hardships they'd been through together had brought them closer together, and their sympathy had finally turned into true love. After class, we'll go for a walk, Will said slyly, turning to face Caroline, because a wolf needs company. Their lips met, but she was embarrassed, taking a step back. Justin will see, Caroline said, her eyes downcast. Kiss, kiss, kiss. I don't mind, came a boyish voice from the room. You see, Will smiled, looking into Caroline's beautiful eyes. He could feel all the worries receding here in the middle of the woods. Suddenly, the rebellious surgeon had found not only a home, a father, but true happiness. What other lover you have no divorce? The daughter-in-law froze at the insolence of her mother-in-law. The girl tried to cover her face with her hands. Around her classmates were running around her and pulling her hair. Ugly. Ben Swan shouted at the top of his lungs. Look at her. Elephant ears. Anne didn't even cry. She was used to being bullied by her classmates. She knew that if she stood still, they would quickly calm down and let her go. That's what happened that time. After about 5 minutes, the excitement disappeared. The girl quickly took her bag and ran towards the house. But when she ran 10 meters, a stone hit her in the back. Ah, she cried out and turned round. Behind her, Ben was laughing at the top of his lungs. The girl cried. Time passed, and the boy's hatred seemed to fade. But her classmates seemed to go mad. Anne had always had a reputation for being the ugliest girl in the class. And then the real miracles began to happen. She became not just a teenager, but a real beauty. Her gorgeous thick hair covered her big ears. Her huge nose seemed to shrink. And Anne's unusually beautiful eyes came to the fore. The girls in her class, sensing great competition, tried their best to uphold a long-standing tradition. What a freak, they whispered behind her. How could the earth be so ugly? By graduation, life had put everything in its place. And the ugly duckling, her beauty, overshadowed all the written beauties of the school. But by the end of her studies, Anne had already formed such a low self-esteem that she could not develop confidence in herself because of her appearance. The girl's parents were ordinary laborers, and they simply had neither the physical strength nor such looks to help their daughter in any way. On the contrary, Anne in their eyes was a girl of modesty, and this was very much appreciated in the society in which they lived. The only thing that saved our heroine was studying. Since she had neither girlfriends nor friends, she devoted all her time to lessons, so that the only student for many years held in her hands a gold medal and dreamed of institute. However, Anne entered the university easily. There were no problems in passing the exams. The examiner even joked at her. I feel that a new luminary of science awaits us, perhaps. He shook the student's hand after the exams were over. And so the small town was left behind. How Anne wished then that her complexes were in the past. But no, she brought them all to the University of Florida, which greatly complicated the girl's life. It's been 17 years. Anne, please look at this document, asked the chief. The woman adjusted her large glasses and began to carefully read every word. What do you think? He exclaimed, folding his arms across his chest. I don't like their condition, she scratched her head. It's a lot to take on. I wouldn't risk it, Anne concluded. Neither would I. We don't know what they'll do with our equipment. Maybe they'll break something on purpose, sighed the director. And I don't like all these non-standard contracts. There are time-tested documents. Why reinvent the wheel? Exactly, because they want to hide something from us, Anne said sadly. Mr. Jason, let's check them out, have another meeting, and then, as they say, either kick them up the arse or hug them. Let's do it. He agreed and walked out of his deputy's office. He kept wiping his sweaty face from the exertion. Anne sighed. She had worked with Mr. Jason for years. She'd come to him from the institute, in fact, and over the years she'd worked hard to grow into a good position. She still had some grasp of other people's psychology, but she had a good grasp of her own. Miami was burning hot. It was the most unbearable heat. Neither fans nor air conditioning could help. Anne put a bottle of ice on her forehead. It always worked for her. Even her head felt like it was going to boil. She sighed, fixed her wedding ring on her finger. Something had to be done. Again, the painful question appeared in her mind. I'm indulging him myself. And what's the result? Anne wondered. What's changed in the last few years? Nothing. How long can you lie on the sofa without working? I don't believe in his illness anymore. Why do others get better, but he doesn't? Anne drove home in a low mood. Every day it seemed to her more and more that her marriage had been a mistake. As soon as the girl began her university studies, her life changed dramatically. Anne's parents did not have so much money to rent her a separate accommodation, so she, like many other students, was lucky she was given a place in the dormitory. But for Anne, it was a real stress. The reserved girl found herself in a room with two other, more open and cheerful students. Friendship between them did not develop, but they lived, in general, not bad. Almost the whole first year, Anne suffered from insomnia. She'd never lived so close to anyone before. And she had her own room at home, and here she was sharing her life with strangers. But her passion for her studies overcame the awkwardness, and Anne concentrated on her studies. In her 5th year, Anne was hired by an industrial equipment company. Before enrolling, Anne never had any doubts that she needed to graduate in engineering. The girl saw great prospects in this field, so from the very first day of her work experience, Anne began to work hard for a better future. And in 3 years, she had already become a leading employee. She was able to take out a flat on credit. It seemed that life had improved. The salary was good. Every now and then she was praised by the general manager. And in 2 years, a new miracle happened. For health reasons, the last director left and strongly recommended to appoint Anne as a director. So, in her almost 30s, Anne was already working as a general manager, and for the next couple of years, she was able to pay off her loan in full and buy herself a car. When she first came to work, the company was headed by Mr. Jason's father, but he soon died suddenly, and the young man took all the responsibility on himself. At first, all the employees were afraid that he would fail. But no, the young man proved to be quite resilient and competent to take his father's company to the next level. I wish it would rain. Anne walked out of the office building. I can't take it anymore. She was originally from the South herself, but the localized climate that Miami had made the city unbearable in the summer. Truth be told, despite the proximity of the ocean, they didn't get out to it that often on weekends. Usually Anne would pick up some paperwork and do something at home. I don't want anything, the woman exhaled, but she was well aware that she still had to stop at the shop. Michael hadn't been out of bed for the last month. At first Anne was very worried about her husband, but then she began to notice the blush on his face. She had various thoughts in her head, but being busy at work and her mother-in-law, although not often, but interfered in their lives. Anne felt as if she were in charge of her husband. Michael was more like her appendage than a separate being. The lack of friends also made things much worse. Anne didn't really have anyone to talk to. Her parents weren't really interested in her affairs. She helped them buy a nice house, so they just lived their lives, and Anne seemed to have everything. She eventually sold her one-bedroom flat, and just before she met Michael decided to invest the money and bought a two-bedroom flat. But here is a family happiness to her never came, although everything started so beautifully. In his 32, Anne finally met him. Or rather, Michael himself approached her. Anne had seen him a couple of times at work. He was the office supplies manager. Michael read the sign that said this office was the office of the chief engineer. Knocking, he was invited in by Mrs. Anne. A Hollywood smile flooded the guest's face. "I'm here to see you. Last time you ordered something, but we didn't have that model then. Can I offer you something in return?" Quickly, he took a huge catalog out of the bag and began to leaf through it. Anne was concentrating on her work and couldn't understand what he wanted from her. "What do you think of this shelving unit?" Michael poked his finger and chose the more expensive options. "It will look great in your interior." The guest was so confused that the general manager poked at the first option and closed the catalog. "A very good choice," Michael said with a smile. "By the way," he glanced at the woman's hands, "I hope you won't mind if I send you a present from me personally." No, Anne didn't take his words to heart. She stared at her papers again. The working day was almost over when there was another knock on Anne's door. She asked to come in. A courier stood in front of her, holding a gorgeous bouquet. She looked at him in bewilderment. "These are for you." The man handed her the flowers. "Please sign." There was a note in the bouquet to the most beautiful woman in the world, she read. "I can't make any sense of it. Maybe someone mixed it up." But the piece of paper definitely had an address and her last name on it. She set the flowers down and concentrated on her work again. Several times she lifted her glasses and wondered who it could be. Anne didn't take the roses home. She safely forgot about them as soon as she grabbed her coat. 3 days later, Michael reappeared in the office. He brought the ordered furniture. He went to see the general manager again. "I hope you like the flowers," he said shyly. "I really wanted to make you happy." "Oh, it was you?" Surprised woman. "Thank you, yes. The flowers were excellent." And yet the next day Anne remembered the flowers and took the roses home. "I realize this may seem indecent of me," the man blushed. "But I'd really like to invite you to dinner," Michael said. Anne blushed too. "I don't even know," she replied simply. "I have so much work to do." "But you can do it once." He pressed her a little. "Please, just one evening." And Anne agreed. Of course, she often traveled to business meetings, restaurants, and clients, but she still had no personal life. In principle, the woman had made her peace with that, and Michael was charming. Every now and then he praised Anne and everything she did. The compliments poured in, making the woman feel uncomfortable. Something in her heart twitched. A strong desire to have a family, and indeed to love and be loved by someone, rose to the surface. Her beloved man looked after her in such a way that it seemed that there was no better man in the whole world. Romance, live concerts, long walks. Anne had given up. For the first time in her life, she let go of her inner tension and fell in love. It's safe to say she was happy then. "Marry me," Michael asked her one day. "Anne, I love you. You're my woman." After this proposal was immediately met with the man's mother. She turned out to be a real angel. Mrs. Caroline kept echoing her son's sentiments. How extraordinary Anne is. The lack of experience of close contact with people did its job, and Anne completely trusted her fiancé and his mother. The wedding was not too pompous, although there were plenty of guests present. And somehow it happened from the beginning that Michael moved into his wife's flat. They wouldn't have been able to live at his mother's place in a one-bedroom anyway. And it all seemed so logical. That's how the family life of our heroine began. It should be emphasized once again that the lack of serious relationships Anne with the opposite sex drew in her imagination great love, for which she was ready to go to the edge of the world. Not immediately, but the woman began to notice that her husband is somehow not quite like the one she imagined. A year after the wedding, Michael quit his job. Then he spent almost a year interviewing for a job, but he never found a decent position. Michael, well, you have a good experience of working with people, his wife Anne advised him. Just start small. I'm sure in a couple of months you'll be noticed and promoted. I'm sick and tired of being on the dole, he said angrily. I can't understand what they want from me. But how can they offer me $30,000 to $40,000 with my skills? You're being paid $150,000. Michael, Anne said, but I'm deputy director now. I have so much responsibility that I'm in charge of all the processes in our company. And you think I had no responsibility in my office? My husband wouldn't give up. No, I've had enough. Either let them pay me at least 60 to 70, or he stopped talking. But not every company will pay a deputy like me $155,000. I know small offices where the deputy director gets $50,000. It depends on the size of the company. As much as Anne wanted to help Michael, she couldn't. She had no idea that her husband's arrogance had not come from nothing. Son, you're so lucky to have her. My darling Mrs. Caroline nodded. Where else would she find such a man? You don't drink, you don't smoke, you don't look at other women. You've got to fulfill yourself, haven't you? While you're looking for a decent job, let Anne support you. It's normal, she stressed the last word, if she's so lucky in life. Though who knows how she got to be the deputy? She said quietly, so that her son wouldn't hear her. Mrs. Caroline did not stoop to primitive insults, but she always spoke plainly. So from the outside she looked like a woman of wisdom who should have listened. Michael, you could say, was a fan of his mother. If he had been asked to name a woman who embodied the feminine ideal, he would have called her name without hesitation. I feel bad for Anne sometimes, Michael admitted honestly. After all, she does work weekends. Michael, times have changed, Mrs. Caroline replied. Who says a man has to support a woman? She raised an eyebrow. And there's no telling what kind of job you'll get. Let's say you're offered a deputy or even a director's position. You have experience, and you know how to communicate with people. And then what do you get? If you get a higher salary, Anne has to feel uncomfortable. That's not the way it works. His mother's arguments seemed reasonable to him. In fact, she was the one who had steered his son in the right direction, so to speak. When Michael told her that he liked a woman who was doing well in life, Mrs. Caroline, in her manner, as if by accident, advised him to look at this Anne. Mrs. Caroline was well aware of her son's worthlessness. She was determined to do everything she could to marry him to Anne. She had a 3-room flat and a huge salary by her standards. Who would want her inactive son? No matter how hard Michael's mother tried, he grew up as an uninitiative guy. He struggled to graduate from college. Twice Mrs. Caroline almost married him off, of course, to girls with a better position. But nobody wanted to look at Michael. So it was his mother, not he, who was behind all the courtship of Anne. She outlined the program point by point, how he should behave, what to talk about, how to dress. From Michael's descriptions, his mother quickly realized that Anne was a common gray mouse, so she had no doubt that she could easily handle her. Somehow, Mrs. Caroline insisted that Michael keep his job for another year. They were going to sack him for irresponsibility, but the woman talked to the director and cried that they needed money for medication. In general, with a bit of grief, Michael was left for another year. At the beginning of the 3rd year of married life, in order not to inflame the situation, he finally accepted the offer of one enterprise. And Anne was happy in a way, too. My son is a businessman, Mrs. Caroline said proudly. He opened a huge bakery, and for the first 6 months everything seemed to be going well. But then, in a flash. What happened? Anne ran up to Michael. When he came home late one night, they made me sign the papers, he said through tears. In her husband's version, the competitors hired thugs and took the bakery away from him. In reality, of course, it was the other way round. Michael, as they say, failed in his elementary duties. In his life, he never had assistants who would knead dough and bake pies for free. Because of his laziness and slackness, he blew it all. 2 weeks after this terrible event, Michael became seriously ill. Again, on his mother's advice. Anne's mind was reeling. Not only had she lost the money she had worked so hard to earn, but now her husband was ill with some rare, incurable disease. "Anne, don't worry," Michael groaned. "Mum will take care of me." Secretly from Anne, Michael wrote a power of attorney for his car, which, incidentally, also bought him a wife. And it wasn't cheap, so now there was an excuse to make it look like Mrs. Caroline had to take care of her son. As far as Anne knew, she was working, but according to her mother-in-law, they let her go when she needed to. Anne was under stress. Her hands shook as she read the doctor's report. "What does it mean?" she asked her mother-in-law. "Is it treatable? Should we go to New York or Los Angeles?" There's no point," Mrs. Caroline sighed. "Anne, he needs a rest. He's exhausted himself because of this business of his." She wept. "My boy has worked so hard for you." Anne felt a hidden reproach. The wife certainly felt some resentment towards Michael, just throwing away $1 million, but now she was ashamed of it. "Don't worry, I'll take care of his treatment myself," said the mother-in-law. "Only the doctor prescribed expensive medication," mother-in-law said carefully. "I'll transfer the money to Michael's card. You can spend as much as you need." "Thank you, darling," Mrs. Caroline hugged her and sobbed. "I have a golden daughter-in-law. How lucky my son is. I'm so grateful to you for not abandoning Michael in his hour of need." To be honest, Mrs. Caroline had been frightened out of her wits when her worthless Michael had lost his pie shop. The woman realized that if some tragic event wasn't introduced now, she might drop him. And to lose such a feeding ground would be a complete folly for both of them. So Michael developed a rare autoimmune disease, naturally incurable. "Mum, I can't stay in bed all the time." Michael sighed. "Are you having a crisis?" she said. "When you go into remission, you'll feel better. So there will be times when you'll be lying down, but most of the time you'll be able to drive your car, go for walks. Are you sick? Be thankful you have such a wonderful wife." Anne did go to the doctor who supposedly treated her husband. He confirmed the diagnosis on the certificate. It didn't even occur to the woman that he'd just been paid off. If she had made Michael retake the tests with another doctor, then everything would have been clarified. But she was used to trusting her husband. And she would never have thought of such perfidy. Anne was secretive, but she was generally good with people. Anne got out of the car and headed for her driveway. She stopped at the shop and bought 2 bags of groceries. It was mostly ready-to-eat or convenience foods. Because of her stressful job, Anne was woefully short of time to do household chores. Mr. Jason had made her not just a deputy, but an assistant, a consultant, and a friend in one person. This, of course, put additional responsibilities on the woman, but basically the chief was the only person she could be friends with. There were never any games or lies between them. They both told each other the truth. She was very comfortable in Mr. Jason's company. In short, she would not hesitate to go on a scouting mission with him if it was offered to her. She opened the door to the flat and immediately heard a groan. She so wished she could have stayed in silence, but her husband's illness was adding to her already frayed nerves. "Hi," she smiled, staring intently into Michael's face. For almost a week she couldn't control herself. Whenever she saw her husband, for some reason she paid attention to the color of his skin. To her surprise, his skin was pink and looked like a normal, healthy person. "How are you feeling?" she asked the traditional question. "Are you hungry?" "No, my mum left a while ago. She fed me," her husband said faintly. "She went to the doctor. He said that in a week or so I should feel better and I should be able to go out." "All right," she smiled wryly. "Then I'll go to work. I have to." "I guess it's my fault," Anne thought, chewing on a cutlet. "I wanted a family so badly, but I didn't realize it wasn't just for one night. I have a job. I can't devote as much time to Michael as he wants. Otherwise, who would work?" Lately, Anne had even started watching programs. She wanted to know how other spouses lived, what they did. "I feel like there's something wrong with me," Anne sighed. "Maybe family is just not my thing. There are women who stay alone for the rest of their lives. Anne had never thought about children. Or rather, she was insanely afraid of this question. Maybe I should see a psychologist? A thought flashed through her head. I won't be able to do that for so long. She covered her face with her hands, tears welling up involuntarily. She rarely felt sorry for herself. She was used to suppressing negative feelings or forbidding herself from feeling them. The next day, during her lunch break, the woman made an appointment with a specialist. End of the working day. Anne was looking forward to it on the one hand, but on the other she was apprehensive. She took a deep breath, knocked on the door, and was invited in. In front of her was a man in his 50s. He smiled radiantly. Anne was touched by the fact that his smile was genuine. She could feel it. I wish I could swim in the sea right now. I can feel with my skin how cool the water is, said the psychologist cheerfully. I am so attracted to the open space. I like the forest more. Anne joined the conversation. There you can hide from prying eyes. Do you think someone is following you? The man asked a provocative question. Sometimes I do, she admitted honestly. I feel that I always have to be on guard. It's the only way I can be safe. And how would you describe this danger? He asked cautiously. You could use adjectives like slippery, cold, terrifying. The guest hesitated. She had never gone so deep inside herself, and immediately she felt fear. I would say danger is someplace where I feel bad, where I feel intense fear. Is that where something is going to happen to you? The psychologist asked a leading question. Can you visualize this event? I just feel that something could happen, and I would suffer a lot, she sighed. Are you happy now? The man asked the unexpected question. Just the very fact that I have you says that you are not. You are already suffering. Anne's lips quivered and tears flowed from her eyes. The psychologist waited silently for her to release her emotions. I feel a constant inner tension. It's wearing me out, she whispered. My husband is seriously ill and I don't know what to do about it. Are you worried that your husband will die? The man asked. Do you feel that you are responsible for his life? No, the patient shook her head negatively. What's the right way to put it? Anne wondered. I'm afraid of being bad. Sometimes I think I can't stand it and imagine leaving my husband. I feel so ashamed. Why do you think that if you don't have the strength to look after him, you must be bad? And anyway, who determines whether a person is bad or good? But it is understandable, the people around us, said the woman. And she was struck by the answer. God, it turns out that I am with my husband not because I love him, but because I want to be good in other people's eyes. In whose eyes exactly? The psychologist kept his eyes on her. Can you name specific people? Yes, my parents, my husband's mother, he himself, she looked at the man pleadingly. Especially the last two. Would you say that your husband and his mother define what you should be? The psychologist concluded. Do you understand? Anne clenched her fingers nervously. As a child, I was constantly laughed at by my classmates, and I didn't think I could ever get married. I never had any friends. Tears came out of her eyes again. So you're saying that because your husband paid attention to you, you're willing to serve him. You were bad in your own eyes. How else do you explain being laughed at? He hurt her feelings. And when someone paid attention to you, were you willing to be anything to avoid feeling humiliated and guilty again? Anne took a break. Went outside. Her hands were shaking. She couldn't seem to hide anything from the psychologist. He could see right through her. 10 minutes later, Anne came back. I've decided that I'd rather be hurt now, but I'd rather be free of this burden once and for all, she said. Anne, why were you bullied by your classmates? The doctor suddenly plunged a knife into her heart. I was ugly as a child, she sobbed. That's why everyone laughed at me. Which girl in your class was the prettiest, please? The man kept his eyes on her. I don't know, she answered timidly. I never thought about it. I thought many of my classmates looked like me. Catherine had ears as big as mine. Elizabeth was very thin. If I told you now that you were no different from any other girl, how would you feel now? Mr. Jason asked. As if there had never been all that mockery of me, Anne answered suddenly. It was just a dream. Exactly. You were never an ugly girl. Can you understand that? Ugliness is so rare. What is it when a child has 11 fingers instead of 10, or one body and two heads like Siamese twins? Everything else is normal. Think of your worst abuser. And now from your current level, tell me, was he or she beautiful? No. Anne immediately thought of Ben Swan, the bully in her class. He even had a nasty look on his face. After the first session, Anne had a real revolution. It was funny to her how she could react to her classmates like that, because it was her reaction that determined everything. If she, as a child, had not believed that she was ugly, they would have all quickly moved away from her. With Michael, the situation was similar. It was just that now she was on the opposite side. After all, he had convinced her that she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Naturally, it was more pleasant to be on this side than as a child, with constant humiliation. Neither of these things will make me happy, Anne whispered as she stopped the car outside the house. I just agreed to marry Michael because he covered my complexes, and I was willing to pay for it. God. I was willing to pay for being treated well and loved. The woman was so scared of feeling powerless again, like when she was a child. So she saw Michael as a guarantee that it would never happen to her again. And if there's a demand, there's always a supply. Nothing new. Anne's request had been heard, and Michael was exactly what she needed. The truth caused a lot of pain, but the woman decided she'd had enough. She was tired of playing the role of the perfect wife. Besides, she felt that everything in her life was one-sided. Anyone would have noticed that from the outside. She walked resolutely into the flat. She decided to distance herself from her husband's illness and be more cold-blooded about the whole situation. Anne, you've come already, said Miss Caroline. Mom said I need to pay the insurance for my car. The wife was silent. Michael looked at her in bewilderment. Anne? He looked into her face and said. Anne was glowing. Since Mrs. Caroline is driving it now, I think she can pay for it, she said calmly. Her husband almost jumped out of bed. Anne noticed the impulse. There was a look of bewilderment in his eyes. I'm already spending almost all the money on your treatment, Anne exclaimed. Let your mother do something to help, she said calmly. The man was not prepared for such a development. He didn't even know what to say to her. I will continue my work with the psychologist, Anne said to herself. Stop writing me. I've never been in anyone's debt. There's nothing wrong with me. And Michael lay there in pain. He'd promised his mother he'd wire her the insurance money tonight. The money Anne had sent for his medication, his mother had already withdrawn and hidden. Michael, what's up? She called him tomorrow morning. I need to drop off the paperwork. Mum, she won't give me the insurance money, her son whispered quietly to her. What Mrs. Caroline snapped out of her role. Is she out of her mind? The mother-in-law was outraged. Oh, I didn't like my daughter-in-law's answer. All these years I've been courting her, and now this. Well, I'll arrange for you. She was angry. If you don't want to be nice, I'll take more money from you. Naturally, Mrs. Caroline could do nothing. She just polluted the air with her profanity. But somehow the woman was sure that she would find a way out of Anne. At the second session, Anne realized even more that something was wrong in her relationship with her husband. Why don't you have children? The psychologist asked the question head-on. It's fear, he glared at the patient. Yes, she said confidently. I'm afraid that I won't be able to cope with motherhood and that I'll be judged. Anne, you have to look at your motivation, that is, what has driven you so far. The doctor said seriously. It hurts me to be humiliated, she replied immediately. So you've been driven by fear? Yes. But that's not all. Anne reflected. She looked at her life, but could only find a constant struggle for her psychological comfort. The second is much harder to see. The psychologist understood her confusion. Your second motivation was to do anything to avoid being yourself. He drew a stunning conclusion. After all, from your childhood experience, it turned out that if you are as you are, then you will surely be punished for it. And since you couldn't change the shape of your ears or shorten your nose, it seemed that you were doomed to humiliation. Being yourself was bad, it was dangerous. Something came up to Anne's throat and she cried. The psychologist had made it clear to her that this was so. The woman had always been afraid of herself. It seemed to her that the true Anne was somehow unseemly. She didn't live up to the standards set. And if she became herself again, she would suffer so much that she might die of pain. That's a lie. The psychologist brought her back to reality. Only when you are yourself will you find true happiness. It is all these imposed roles that create suffering in your life. You must have the courage to look at the Anne you have inside you. There is no other way. Perhaps Anne could have said it was the most important day of her life. But there was a real revolution in her mind from the mere idea that she wasn't real now. Her fear receded. So Anne decided, no matter what, to only move forward. On the way home, a strange thought popped into her head. She turned the car around and drove towards a medical center. Anne had been there a couple of times before. "Would you go tomorrow at 11 o'clock? The nurse asked her. "We will come with the doctor because we have to take blood for a test." Why Anne had decided not to warn Michael, she didn't know. It was just her intuition that told her to do it that way. "I don't want him to get nervous early," the woman made up a reason for herself. She was a little embarrassed that her husband wasn't talking to her. Perhaps earlier she would have liked to know why, but then she somehow just took it all in stride. The next morning she went into the chief's office to excuse herself for an hour. Mr. Jason was sitting there with a sad face. "Did something happen to you?" she asked fearfully. "Are you pale? Do you have blood pressure?" "No," he sighed. "It's just a family emergency, but it'll pass." He tried to smile. Mr. Jason was going to celebrate his 45th birthday this year, but things hadn't worked out. The children had grown up and moved into their own flat, bought by their father. And with his wife, they lived like strangers. "I'm tired," Mr. Jason admitted. "You know, sometimes I think about selling the business. I can't take it anymore." "I understand." The woman sat down on the table. "You and I are like two squirrels in a wheel. We're going to get kicked out of it someday. The only question is whether we'll be alive afterwards." "I don't know," he said seriously. "Anne, why do I need all this? I've got everything I need. I want a peaceful old age." "You are still young," smiled the assistant. "The midlife crisis ages us all. You and I live in such a beautiful place, but we don't have time to go to the ocean," he sighed. "Mr. Jason, I need an hour with my husband." "The doctor has to be here?" Anne asked. The man waved his hand. He trusted his deputy like he trusted himself. He'd never had a problem with Anne. "Is there any point in trying to keep the family together if I discussed her?" Mr. Jason reasoned. Lucy had already fulfilled her every whim, and now she was no longer interested in me. His wife's coldness had become annoying of late. People always think that lack of money is the only problem for scandals in a family. But Mr. Jason could say with complete certainty that it didn't make any difference. You can be loved for money. But when you get so much of it that a person stops hiding their sincere intentions from you, that's the end of it. Lucy, Mr. Jason's wife, was no longer afraid of losing him. It seemed to him that she was even deliberately doing everything she could to make him the first to offer her a divorce. That way the woman could get a great deal of money. And considering the fact that Lucy had never worked, it still wasn't fair in her husband's eyes. Of course he wasn't going to leave her penniless, but to give away half of the business, just like that, was a real sacrilege. "All right," he sighed. As long as it lasted. We'll see about that." Anne glanced nervously at her watch. She was due home at 10:45. Mrs. Caroline, according to Michael, usually visited him at an hour or two when she brought him a fresh lunch. She opened the flat door, entered quietly, peered into her husband's room and froze. The bed was empty. Anne went through all the rooms, but Michael wasn't home. So Anne decided to call him. "Michael, hello." She took an air and tried to say each word calmly. "How are you? What are you doing?" "Hi," he said quietly. "Anne, what can I do? I've been lying around all day. I can't even get to the loo. Mom should be here soon." There was a click, and the door opened. My husband Michael appeared in the corridor. He almost fell through the floor when he saw Anne. I went to the drugstore. I didn't want to upset you, he mumbled in his defense. I could barely make it back. Get down. The wife ordered him to lie down. The doctor is coming to examine you. Why? Michael asked Anne a strange question. The doctor just came the other day. Well, as they say, trust but verify, she said angrily. Come on, they'll be here in a minute. I'm not going to see another doctor. Michael got angry and sat down on the couch. If you don't trust me, say so. He began to use a clever trick. That's it. Anne screamed. Her husband has never seen her so angry. Do you think you found a fool? That's it, I've had enough. Or you stop this comedy. She rushed into the corridor and ran out of the flat. Oh shit, Michael cursed at himself. Why did I go to the shop, you idiot? What's going to happen now? He dialed his mother's number. Anne drove to work and sobbed. She hated everyone, especially herself. She had to be so stupid. Divorce him, she said to herself. Let the dependent get out of my flat. A bloody Alfonso. That's it, I've had enough. She closed herself in her office and there was a knock. She didn't open the door right away. The chief came in. Anne, what are you doing? He was frightened. Anne. He ran for cold water. Mr. Jason, how can you be such an idiot? She stammered. He played a trick on me. He was never sick, do you understand? He just didn't want to work, and he thought I'd just keep feeding him. So the man scratched his head. This is all very familiar to me. Get your things, he ordered and grabbed her arm. Mr. Jason deftly fitted himself into the rows of cars. 40 minutes later, they pulled onto the open motorway. On the way, the chief stopped to buy cold water and something to eat. The two of them sat on a deserted beach. Mr. Jason knew a couple of good places like that, silent and staring off into the distance. You could tell that both the man and the woman were experiencing the same thing. I told her first. The chief turned to Anne. I can't take it anymore. I come home and she turns her nose up at me. I'm sick of it. At first I was ashamed in front of the kids, but they're grown up and have their own lives. I'm going to file for divorce too. Mr. Jason, how could you use me like that? The assistant whispered. I'm not made of iron. Somehow he's convinced he's the only one who needs me. What's wrong with me? She looked at the man. Anne, yes, all this is nonsense, he smiled. This I say to you as a representative of the stronger sex. As for me, you should be chased by a crowd of men. Do you want me to prove it to you tonight? You'll be fighting off your admirers. You owe me a nice dress and loose hair. Where are we going? She asked Jason hesitantly. I don't know, Anne. But you've known me for days, he stroked her head. How could I get you into anything bad? No, she shook her head negatively. All right then, I accept your challenge. She rose to her feet. Stop being a whiner. If I want to be happy, I have to do it myself. It was about 7 o'clock. When they got back to the office, she got into her car. They'd arranged for Mr. Jason to pick her up at 9. She didn't even pay any attention to her husband. Quickly, she went into her room, locked herself in, pulled out her prettiest dress, put on her eyelashes, unraveled her ponytail. She heard her mother-in-law's voice behind her back. We need to talk, she said in a commanding voice. Anne said nothing to her and left the flat. Mrs. Caroline stared at her in bewilderment. Where is she going? The mother asked her son Michael, who came up to her. I don't understand. Meanwhile, Anne jumped into the car with the chief. He smiled. Let's go, shall we? He laughed. I hope you're not going to leave me, Mr. Jason. What if someone comes on to me? The woman was afraid. You're not alone. Your beau will be sitting nearby. He pointed his finger at himself. Anne laughed merrily. She had seldom experienced such a state of lightness and joy. Well then, let's get on with the adventure. The passenger commanded, and the car started. They stopped outside a decent club. Mr. Jason knew that it was a respectable men's club, so it wasn't the sort of place where fighting or brawling was part of the program. "Come out," he said, giving his lady a hand. "You had a husband, and now you are completely free. So put a smile on your face." It was Anne's first time in a place like this. She raised her head high and seemed to swim to the table. Mr. Jason deliberately sat down at another. No sooner had Anne looked at the menu than a waiter approached her. He was holding a bottle of wine. "This is for you from that gentleman over there." The guy gently showed his hand, along with wishes for a good evening. Anne, like a lady of the world, inclined her head in agreement, turned round and looked at the chief. He was smiling at her with his arms crossed over his chest. Mr. Jason was absolutely right. About 10 people had met her today. "You are simply irresistible." An older man said to her, "Shall we play roulette?" A lady like that must love gambling. "Unfortunately, I am an exception to the rule," she smiled. "Besides, my man should be here soon." All in all, in an hour, Anne was even tired. She was not used to such attention from men. The chief noticed her uneasiness and sat down beside her. "I counted 11, he said cheerfully. "Well, shall we dance now?" He held out his hand to her. Anne was afraid to tell him that she had never danced in her life. But Mr. Jason quickly put his arm round her waist and led the way. "Mr. Jason, you've opened up a whole new world for me." She couldn't catch her breath when they returned to the table. "But this place is more for flings," he admitted. "But that doesn't change anything." "Oh, you." Anne wanted to tell him, but she laughed out loud. "That's why they come to me so easily." "But I couldn't tell you that," said the chief seriously. "Otherwise you would never have agreed." The night brought a little chill, and the colleagues walked along the deserted street. "I love it when the crickets sing," Mr. Jason said. "You know, it's been a long time since I've had a rest. Thank you, Lord. It's like I've lost 10 years, he said. "You know, I don't want to lie. I don't want to go home," she said. "My husband is the past of my life." "I feel the same way now. Anne, we have to move on," he stopped in front of her. "Our fixation on all these standards. Oh my God. It's like I've just woken up from a long sleep," Anne whispered. "What have I done to myself? I've hated myself all this time." It was about 3 o'clock when Mr. Jason stopped the car outside her house. They were silent for a while. Neither of them wanted to break the magic silence. "See you tonight," he said quietly. "Until today," she repeated. The principal watched her swim towards the driveway. Anne's luxurious hair fluttered in the wind. "A stunning woman," he sighed. "Why hadn't we met before?" Michael sat in the corridor, leaning against the wall, asleep. He never waited for his wife to return. She hadn't returned his calls. Anne shamelessly stepped over him and locked herself in her room. She didn't care. The divorce issue had been settled. Now it was only a matter of time for Anne. She had no interest in Michael and what would happen to him now. She got up early on purpose. It wasn't even 7 o'clock. Anne dressed quickly. She didn't want to see her husband. He was still lying in the corridor. He opened his eyes abruptly, rushed to his wife's room, but it was closed. Did she not sleep at home tonight? He thought in horror. God, what's happening to her? He rang his mother, who promised to come soon. Mrs. Caroline was very nervous about her daughter-in-law. She really didn't like the whole story. God forbid she should find someone else, she said, pacing up and down the room. Michael, how could you do this to me? I told you to lie down. You should be up and about by next week. She won't even talk to me, the son said through his tears. So is Mum going to be with me now? If she... There will be no divorce, she threw angrily at him. Nobody needs your Anne but you. Maybe she just couldn't take it, found herself a man for the evening. No one's going to have a serious relationship with her. Have you seen the glasses she wears? She's a skank, for God's sake. How can you even sleep in the same bed with her? Mrs. Caroline was deliberately exaggerating Anne's shortcomings. She didn't know that last night her daughter-in-law had shown her beauty to the full. And if only she'd given a reason, Someone would have hit on her. "Mom, talk to her," Michael begged. "I can't do this without her. I love her." "Tell her you love her money," she said angrily. "All right, I'll stay with you tonight. Otherwise, I won't catch her." Anne was almost asleep by her computer when the chief came in and put a mug of strong coffee in front of her. "How are you?" he asked her thoughtfully. "Anne, I was up almost all night, as if in some kind of euphoria. But I can't open my eyes now," Mr. Jason smiled. "I'm starving," she whispered, resting her head on the table. "Come on, get up," said the headmaster. "Let's go to lunch. I'm starving myself." They dragged themselves to the car. She thought she fell asleep on the way. Mr. Jason ordered some interesting juice, and they felt energized immediately afterwards. "That's it." The man wiped his flushed face. "Can you feel the blood rushing through your body?" he asked Anne. "What is it made of?" she asked. "There are some berries in it, but the main ingredient is natural pomegranate juice." "The additives are up to you," said Mr. Jason. He looked at Anne with undisguised curiosity. And the day came to an end. Mr. Jason was returning home with a strange feeling. He had already gone up to the first floor when he clearly felt that the time had come. "Lucy," he knocked on the door of his wife's room. "Can we talk to you?" "About what?" she said nonchalantly, not leaving the room. That gave Mr. Jason even more confidence in his next move. "About us," he said coldly. "Come out, please. This is serious." Lucy deliberately delayed her exit. Finally, the door opened, and she cast a disgruntled glance at her husband. "Lucy, let's not lie to ourselves," he said simply. "We don't love each other and haven't for a long time." "So what do you suggest?" carelessly threw the wife. "Don't spoil my mood for the night." "Divorce," he replied seriously. "Lucy, I don't see the point of our relationship anymore." The woman shuddered at first, then quickly pulled herself together and paused. "All right," Lucy finally replied, "if that's what you decide." She wanted to make him feel guilty. "Yes, I have made up my mind," Mr. Jason said firmly. "And if you don't mind, then you've made up your mind too." The wife didn't want to show her weakness. She would have liked the abandoned woman option, so she could vilify her husband later. Mr. Jason understood that. In recent years, he had unraveled Lucy's true nature to the point where nothing could surprise him. "I'll talk to the children myself," he suggested. He hesitated about the property. "I agree that you should take your half." Lucy was very happy with that. But Mr. Jason was no fool. He'd been in business too long. His wife was already planning how she would take over his business, but she was in for some unpleasant news. But the time had come. He dialed someone's number. "Hi, Brad. Have you changed your mind about buying my company yet?" he said. Anne was in no mood to go home. She was desperate for sleep. She entered the flat. "Good evening," her mother-in-law said with a certain intonation. "Anne, could we talk to you for a moment?" Anne nodded. She wanted to put an end to the whole story. Everyone sat down at the kitchen table. "Well, I guess I'll start," said Mrs. Caroline. "Anne," her tone softened, "we were afraid to tell you, so as not to spook your luck. Anyway, a week ago Michael's doctor informed me that he was much better. He also sternly instructed me that Michael should not take any risks for the time being. With his illness, deterioration can occur very quickly. But Michael was so tired of his illness that he told no one that day and went outside." "I see," Anne replied calmly. "Mrs. Caroline, I beg you, please help Michael to pack his things." Mother and son looked at each other. They couldn't understand what was going on in this situation. "It would be better for him to stay with you," calmly answered her daughter-in-law to her bewilderment. "Michael will recover much faster with you." But she didn't know what to say. "Anne, this is his home. Besides, I work too," said Mrs. Caroline. "That's all right. As they say, home will help," Miss Anne smiled. "And as for this being Michael's house, I'm sorry to disappoint you. This is my flat, and your son will no longer be living there." "Anne, What are you doing? My husband turned pale. We're family. I love you. Well, I doubt that very much. Anne got up from the table. All right, guests. I'll give you half an hour, take everything you need, and the rest you can pick up later. I'm sorry, I'm very tired today. Michael wanted to make a scene, but his mother signaled him with her hand. She realized that if he overplayed his hand now, they'd never get her back. And it was foolish to lose such a tidbit. Anne had already drifted off to sleep when she heard it. We're going. She didn't say anything, only heard the lock click and rolled over onto her other side. Mom, she's crazy. Michael couldn't calm down. That idiot kicked us out. Yeah, I'm not even going to look at her after that. Michael, calm down, said his mother. If she won't change her mind, then you'll have to make sure you get half the property. Don't be silly. No arguments. Do you understand me? I understand. He sat down tiredly on the bed in his old room. Why did I have to go to that damn shop? He lamented. Everything would be back to normal now. But Michael didn't realize that if it hadn't been for this incident, another one would have happened. Anne was just ripe for another life. They would have broken up anyway. And if he looked honestly, Michael initially had nothing to gain by the breakup of his and Anne's relationship. The next morning, Anne wasn't embarrassed by her husband's absence. She even felt like she should be. Happy, she went to work, dropped her bag, knocked on the door to the boss. Mr. Jason, thank you. You have helped me change my life. She said happily, that's it. I'm divorcing Michael. I don't want to do this anymore. Anne, I've got news for you too, the boss told her with a serious face. I sold the company, so you will have a new boss. Anne immediately covered her face with her hands and cried. How can I be without you? Jason tried to comfort her, but she continued to cry. No amount of coaxing worked. Let's go out tonight, Jason suggested. We could sit somewhere together, okay? He stared into her eyes. Yes, she said, and sobbed again. It'll be okay. I promise. He put his arms around her and pulled her close. We'll have a serious talk tonight. The work wasn't going well. Anne looked at her watch every now and then. She had lost all interest in what she was doing. The director was not only her boss but also her friend, and it was not easy for her to be so close to another person. She was almost pulling up to the house when Michael called. Anne deliberately didn't pick up the phone. Yes, idiots, she cursed. I don't need you. What, you lost your feeder? Now you're just going to have to bite your elbows. Anne had no doubt that Michael was acting under the careful guidance of his mother, Mrs. Caroline. If he wanted his things, he'd find them himself, she decided, so she didn't stay home too long. Anne stood outside the restaurant to which Mr. Jason had invited her. With over an hour to go before the meeting, she just closed her eyes and dreamed. I want a baby, Anne whispered. God, why did I ever want Michael? I never loved him. He was like a leech on me, although now I realize why. The phone rang. It was the chief. He wanted to tell her he'd be here early. I'm already here, Anne laughed. I'm sitting in the car waiting for you. Where are you? She stepped out of the driver's door. Jason was standing by the door. He was holding a gorgeous bouquet. Anne blushed. These are for you. He handed her the flowers. Are you ready to have a good time tonight? You bet, she smiled. Jason, I'll go to the end of the world with you. The man took her by the waist, and they walked in. He had a lot to tell his deputy today. Anne, I'm divorcing my wife, he began. To be fair, I sold my company to a good man, but not for the amount of money that's in the contract. Don't worry, there's nothing criminal about it. It's just that my wife is a bit of an arsehole. I'm sorry, but I don't want to go along with her. So I gave her half, or rather a third, of what I got for the firm. I'm not giving her the house either. Of course, she doesn't want to leave it, so she'll have to pay me my half. Don't worry. What she made in the divorce will last her till she's old enough, unless she spends $1 million a month. What are you going to do now? Miss Anne asked with interest. You're a real professional. But professionals retire, too, he laughed. Anne, I want a normal life. I need someone who understands me, a reliable friend. The man kept his eyes on her. Anne realized that he was referring to her. Inside her, it was like butterflies were flying. Anne lowered her eyes, her breathing could be heard. She drank some juice as her throat was dry. Anne, I don't want to play. I like you. Took her hand in his. In fact, I think we're made for each other. How Anne at that moment wished she could go back to her childhood and show her classmates who she had become. What kind of man had chosen her? You bastards, this is for you, flashed through her mind. I'm a decent woman, so I want a decent man. I give you time to think, came Mr. Jason's voice to her. And I can answer at once, seriously, she said. I do. I want a normal family. I want to have children. We'll have children. I promise you, he pressed her hand in his. Anne had never had an evening like this in her life. She stood by her car, afraid to let Jason go. He didn't want to leave her either. The goodbye kiss came to an end. They hugged once more, and she got into the car. I'll see you tomorrow, he waved. Good night to you. The woman looked at him intently, but Anne's night was not going to be a very restful one. So far, she knew nothing about it. Driving home, it seemed to her that her car did not touch the ground. Here it is, my long-awaited happiness, she said aloud. We had worked side by side for so many years, and only now we realized that it was fate. She saw the light from the corridor and realized that Michael was home. Michael's doctor arrived today. He's taken a turn for the worse. Because of your scandal, he could die? Please help my son, Mrs. Caroline exclaimed. I can't. Anne shrugged her shoulders. I'm getting married. What her mother-in-law was surprised. What do you mean you're getting married? What about Michael? He'll die without you. But I'm not to blame for his illness, she glanced at her husband. If you've come to get your things, I'll wait. You can't do that, Michael's mother said sternly. Or did you have a lover? Her eyes narrowed and she looked like a fox. Was that the reason? No, Anne didn't want to continue the conversation. I just met my man the other day, so there was no question of cheating. Her mother-in-law's little eyes darted back and forth. She couldn't figure out what she needed to do to get things back to normal. Anne, her voice softened. But you realize Michael loves you. To know a man for a couple of days and leave a husband like that? She shook her head. I can assure you it's such a relief, Anne grinned. Take it easy. Michael couldn't take it anymore. I've worked so hard to make sure you have everything. She laughed. Are you saying I've been living off you all this time? You have no conscience at all? How much effort I put into my cafe, and all for you. You mean the pie shop that I gave you over $1 million for? Anne had no more patience for these insolents. That's it. I've had enough. Get out. Get out of my flat. She pointed at the door. I just hate you, you sneaky bastards who've been sitting on my neck all this time. Get out. You're going to regret this. Are you going to come crawling back to Michael on your knees? My mother-in-law threatened to say goodbye. Who cares about you, you little bogeyman? My son is a fool for paying attention to you. Ruined his life. She didn't even think it was possible to do such a cruel thing. It's all coming to a head. Anne closed the door behind her guests and sat down on the sofa. God, and how could I have been so blind? They were just using me, she sobbed. Anne was going to leave something to her husband after the divorce. His car she definitely wanted to give him. But after what he and his mum had done, she went on principle. The car had been bought with her money, and she could easily prove it. Michael wasn't working at the time, so the truth was on her side. No matter how hard Mrs. Caroline tried, no matter what lawyer she sent to her, they couldn't do anything. Anne, come on, screamed the guests at the wedding. Mr. Jason kept up with her. This time Anne was having all the fun she could. Miss Anne and her husband were always participating in contests. After signing in, they sat down at the table. Mr. Jason held his wife close to him. She kissed him. My happiness. He kept his eyes on her. Anne, darling. Tears came out of his eyes. And then they went on their honeymoon. The newlyweds didn't want to advertise or surprise anyone. They just went on a tour of Europe. God, this stuff is delicious. Anne closed her eyes in pleasure when she tasted real Viennese waffles. She greedily absorbed everything around her. She hadn't realized she was enjoying the story so much. Jason, look at this, she pointed at the medieval temple. They were standing in a square that was surrounded by stunning buildings. The honeymoon had strengthened the couple even more. They chatted for hours on end. Anne had never experienced, even in her dreams, that it was possible to live like this. Mr. Jason was a grown man, so he didn't give Anne a hard time when someone looked at her or wanted to meet her. Where did this one come from? You're not an ice cream. I can't leave you alone for a minute, he grinned. From Namibia. He complimented me on my beauty, he laughed. Sometimes I wish you'd taken off your glasses when you were wearing them. You didn't get hit on so often by suitors, he supported her laughter. And a year after that journey, Anne had a daughter, a tiny baby Elvira. I've always wanted my daughter to be called Elvira, her father shook her contentedly. I think with such a name she will be a real schoolgirl. I can't wait to chase her. You'll complain later. I'd rather she was in the pram asleep. Anne laughed. Look at her, she's already restless. Elvira changed her voice and waved her arms. Well, Fidgety, come here. Anne took her daughter in her arms and pressed her to her chest. No one had ever thought it was possible to play with one's life like this.
Fiona pulled out of her pocket a small photograph of her son, carefully sealed in cellophane. In the digital age, it's impossible to disappear so that there's nothing left of you. Vincent has been preserved in hundreds, if not thousands, of snapshots, videos, group photos. He's at a wedding, a birthday party, picking up his daughter from the hospital, and everywhere, cheerful, smile to the ears, and nothing really upsets him. But the closest thing Fiona has to a picture of him is a small photograph of him from his studies. Vince isn't just a sailor, he's a graduate, she used to say on such occasions, and pride filled her soul. Then her son and the other applicants were told to bring exactly 3 pictures, 3 by 4 centimeters. Why that number? Why 3? She didn't remember. The atelier took 4 photos, which was the standard. His son had given 3 to the dean's office, and Vince had left one for his mother to keep in case she needed it. And she'd liked that little thing better than all the presents he'd given her, and the son was grateful. He bought her a meat grinder, a coffee grinder, a rheumatism pillow, and a zirconium bracelet. He gave her money, not a son, but gold. Fiona told her friends, "Oh, Mom, are we going to sue or what?" Tina, the daughter-in-law, asked impatiently, where did he find such a chick? When Vince had first brought his future wife home, Fiona hadn't liked her. She wrinkled her nose like she didn't like the smell of sauerkraut soup. But Fiona had made a huge pot of it that day, not enough for a company, of course, but enough for a squad that cooked for a whole week so they wouldn't have to think about it. Tina is not like that. She cooks a little at a time, cook and eat. With a mom like that, Mike won't get fat. Mom, why aren't we talking? My daughter-in-law wouldn't stop. Are you hoping for something else? Where are we going to live, Mom? At these words, Fiona usually began to cry, but to herself. No one heard the sobs or saw the tears. From the outside, it looked like she was just staring into the void, but there was a fire raging inside. She gave up quickly. Fiona thought at times like this. I told him, but Tina had done at least one good deed. And what a good one. She gave her a grandson that all the neighbors envied. Mike, at the age of 4, already spoke well, knew all the letters and could count to 10. If it wasn't for him, Fiona would have gone mad a long time ago. And Mike appreciated her simple cooking, sauerkraut soup, homemade cutlets, finger-thick pancakes, and other culinary delights. Mom, Tina persisted. Oh, I'm not your mother. Fiona shouted harshly. I'm not your mother, get it through your head. Why was her daughter-in-law so rude to her? She could have called her you like the day she met her. Oh yes, she suggested we use you. How could it be otherwise with her son's future wife and future mother of grandchildren? Maybe Fiona's too hard on her daughter-in-law. Tina's understandable too. Fiona's only looking at their situation from her own vantage point. It must be hard for Tina too, But that's no reason to call her mom. Just answer me a question. Tina pleaded for the umpteenth time. We have to do this together. I want it to be legal. The law. She's a lawyer. She knows all the ins and outs of the law. Vince was a simple man. He did his own repairs and rebuilt his car in the garage. If Mike had been a little older, he'd have started to get into men's work. All the more reason for him to take an interest in them. All the time he walked around the house with a toy screwdriver and hammer and looked for something to fix. He even asked her, "Me, Tina, my soul," Fiona said in a different tone of voice. "Let's wait a little longer." "How can you do that to a living person? How can we wait any longer?" Tina replied, and her face twisted. "I've been waiting for a whole year. I have to live somehow. And your grandson too, by the way." At times like this, Fiona stared at Mike's face, and then she'd be reassured. No, that's definitely her grandson. Same forehead, same nose and eyes, and most of all, the smile. She remembered Vincent smiling at the same like twin brothers, only 30 years apart. When Tina started to talk about how she should live her life, Fiona's doubts crept into her soul. "Why have you already looked for someone?" Fiona asked sternly and answered without waiting for an answer. "If you've got your eye on her, don't bring her into the house." Mike Vinzalevich shouldn't see such things. It was Tina's turn to take offense. She, a sailor's wife, was used to her husband's long business trips. The ocean is such a thing. Here errors are measured not in minutes, but in weeks. And a small trip for a month could well turn into a 6-month absence. She had always counted the days until they met and had never given even the slightest reason to doubt her own fidelity. But now was a different matter. And who better than his wife to understand that? "Enough. I'm tired," said Tina. "I'm tired of these quarrels of accusations. I don't need anything from you personally. I'm doing What about watching Mike?" Fiona interrupted. "Thank you for that. But I could do it myself." Of course she could, thought Fiona. She can't boil her own soup. She can't light a candle. A child is hard work. She taught her everything, even how to swaddle and rock the baby. After all, they had a good relationship at first, and Fiona really tolerated Tina calling her mom. But then they couldn't take it anymore, and they had a fight. "You're yelling," Fiona tried to attack again, but Mike hears everything. He hears and remembers. "I'm not the only one yelling," Tina replied. "We've been standing here for half an hour wasting time, and you still haven't answered my question." She switched to you. It cut Fiona like a knife. One moment, and they'd be strangers. What's it to her? She'll find herself a new man. Maybe she'll have kids for him. She'll call another woman mom. And what's left for her, Fiona? Just Mike. Vincent's her only child. She wanted a second one, but it wasn't meant to be. She'd go to the ends of the earth for Vince like a Decemberist wife. Except she's not a wife, she's a mother. "Oh, I am, by the way," Tina said, bracing herself. But at that moment a boy ran in. "Mommy, woman," Mike shouted. The letter, where did you find it?" Tina asked. She picked up the envelope, which for some reason had no writing on it except their address. Under the door. Fiona felt uncomfortable in any government offices. She stepped on the parquet flooring and feared damaging it. She looked at the luxurious wall and ceiling finishes, the expensive furniture, and felt like a poor relative visiting a rich uncle. True, today she was greeted with a friendly welcome and talked to her as if she owed her something. But she often watched soap operas and remembered how in one movie they talked to a seriously ill boy in the same tone, and they promised him everything. "It's a pity that only Mom came," said the big boss. "We would have had a wife, of course, but we mothers can easily understand each other and find a common language. We had to go far away, to the regional center, not a very close light. And for some reason, no one told her the reason. They only said that it had to do with her son. Although the workers tried to make her feel welcome, Fiona felt uncomfortable. All those high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, it wasn't hers. It felt awkward and scary, as if Fiona could do something that would make the expensive parquet crack, or the chandelier collapsed. The woman did not understand any chic, neither this ingratiating tone nor the essence of the conversation. She was received by the head of some department. Fiona didn't remember her title or name. She sat down at a long table right next to her, explained something, and held her hand. "How is it that you are being held hostage?" Fiona asked. "What do you mean kidnap?" The woman in the red jacket only shrugged her shoulders. Fiona's mind was a jumbled mess. All she knew was that her son was at sea, that he was working for some African company. It's not a cruise, not an easy ride, but hard work. Vincent is an expert. He can fix the engine of a huge diesel ship under the most difficult conditions. How could he be taken hostage? The warden was literally trying to sweeten the pill. She put a cup of tea in front of her, a plate of candy, and cookies. But the terrible news about her son made her unable to eat. A woman of strong character never showed that she was afraid or hurt, but this is different. It's like they're hiding something from the old lady. What are we supposed to do? Fiona asked. All we can do is be patient, the woman said. A whole team of specialists is working on your son's rescue. If anyone can help him, it's them. How do you call them? Fiona asked again. Those specialists. Oh, unfortunately, I can't tell you, the woman sighed. Actually, it's a secret. I signed an affidavit. I could get in trouble. I've already said too much, like a mother to her mother. The day before, the call had taken the whole family by surprise. It was the 5th month of Vince's voyage, and he was due to return. The ocean is an element. Even experienced sailors do not say categorically the day of the end of the voyage. Then he had to get on a plane to Manchester, and from there to their distant destinations. So when the high office called, neither she nor Tina took it too seriously. Come to think of it, an offer to come to the administration office. Her daughter-in-law went to pick up her child from the kindergarten, and she, Fiona, went to the meeting with the affair after the words of the woman in the beautiful jacket. However, there were more questions than answers. There hadn't been a call or a message from Vincent in a month. In principle, this was not unprecedented. The sea was an element. Ships break down, get lost, and then take a long time to find them in open water. But Vince had been sailing for 10 years. He'd always come back in one piece. That's why they were worried, but not too worried. What do they want with them? Fiona asked. She had finally regained her ability to think. Money, the woman in the red jacket sighed. All terrorists want money. So let's raise it, Fiona suggested. Let's put out a call to the whole world. We can't, said the woman. Why did we call you here? So you wouldn't think of transferring any money, let alone collecting it. So that you sit quietly and wait for the situation to be resolved. We don't know for sure what could hurt them. It's a very complicated situation. You must understand that. So you can't even write to Andrew? Fiona asked. Oh, absolutely not, the woman nodded. No publicity. Me. Why not? Fiona wondered. I'm telling you again, the woman said in a tone that brooked no objection. They're specialists. You can't interfere with them. They may call you, write to you, demand money, ask for an interview. Do not agree. This is a very serious situation. When Fiona returned to her hometown, the weather was perfect. Spring had sprung. Here by the sea, the seasons are smoothed out. And after a little inclement weather, warmth comes at once, and with it, hope. But Fiona was not happy about the good weather. She couldn't believe what was happening. It turns out that her Vincent, a longtime sailor, had been taken hostage. Why? Who had kidnapped him? When did this happen? Apparently not more than a month ago. They were talking on Messenger. Everything was fine. What's she gonna tell her daughter-in-law? What about Mike? That night, she and Tina had their first big fight. Vincana's wife demanded maximum publicity, kept trying to record the clips on her expensive cell phone and call the TV stations. And Fiona talked her out of it. Her grandson watched the bickering and wept bitterly. At some point, they were both so distracted that they didn't notice the boy at all. I'm telling you, Fiona, that you have to shout. You have to ring all the bells, Tina said. Otherwise, they won't get my husband out. Oh, for God's sake, replied Fiona. I told you to stay out of the way. Don't make any calls. Don't answer any calls. Mike's father is being taken away, and you're so calm about it. The daughter-in-law wouldn't. It was then that the attitude towards her son's wife began to change. 6 months of waiting had worn them both out. And most importantly, Tina began to insinuate that Vincent's apartment should be left. She shouldn't be living there now that her son was missing. Fiona was also financially involved in the construction and renovation, so she pretended not to understand the hints. They'll manage, Fiona said, either to herself or to her daughter-in-law. Do you know what kind of trouble Vince had gotten himself out of? They'll be fine. But Tina didn't say anything. She had calmed down a little and was looking at her son with fear and hope. So the letter. Tina held it in her hands for a long time, hesitating to open it. It offered some hope, but only as long as it remained sealed. If the envelope was torn open, the magic would be gone. Her mother-in-law looked at her without trying to take the letter, as if she recognized her priority right to the news. But Mike was impatient. He had not forgotten that he had a father, and every day he waited for his return. "Oh, Mom, open up," he said. "It's Daddy. Is there a car in there?" The little boy took after his father. He just adored machinery. Tina and her mother-in-law bought him cars that could be disassembled and reassembled with a toy screwdriver. The child loved to twist nuts and kept imagining how he would fix a real car with his dad. Mike hadn't forgotten that his father brought him a lot of toys from every voyage. The best unprecedented one. Tina opened the envelope. Alas, there was no miracle. Instead of a letter from her husband, instead of a little news about him, a lawsuit from the bank. They'd bought the apartment with a mortgage, and Vince was handling the payments. He'd throw money into the account himself, usually with a reserve. But many months ago, the money ran out. She's already gotten calls from the bank threatening eviction. "Might please collect principal, interest, legal fees," she read disappointedly. "Hey, you foreclose on the apartment and put it up for public auction. We have to pay." Said the mother-in-law. "You don't want us to be thrown out on the street, do you?" Tina, of course, was not a lawyer, but she understood the seriousness of the situation well. If there are no payments, if the bank loses money, it will definitely want to take the apartment. Nothing will stop this financial institution. Neither a weeping widow with a living husband, nor a small child. Only a balanced and reasoned position could make a difference. She was promised to the last minute that they would not be evicted anywhere, and the bank would not go to court. This was said both in the bank and in the administration. Apparently, they changed their minds, or a new employee came and did everything in his own way. Tina began to sob. Tears shook her shoulders, choked her, and she couldn't stop. "Oh, let me read it," asked her mother-in-law. She took the documents, began to look at them, and even recognized familiar letters and words. But where could she understand the meaning of the sentences? All that was obvious to Fiona was that they wanted to throw her out on the street. She had nowhere to go. Fiona held back, put the letter in her bag, and went to the administration office. This time, the officials were not so friendly. She had been here twice since that day, but they had never offered her tea and candy. And today, the head of the department was in no hurry to see her. She made her wait for an hour and then went out into the corridor. Fiona noticed that she was wearing a different jacket, one half white, the other black. It wasn't anything beautiful, but it was probably worth a lot. "No news," the woman said. "Nothing encouraging. We'll just have to wait. Here, take a look." Said Fiona and showed the woman the lawsuit. She probably knew the law. As she read, she nodded her head as if in agreement with the bank. Fiona looked at her face, less than 40 years old, still young and already in such a position. She must be promoting someone, or she must be a very valuable specialist herself. "Well," said the official, "the situation is difficult, but not critical. Are you already working with a lawyer? If I don't have money for a loan, where will I get money for a lawyer?" Fiona asked her. "There's no need to despair," the woman said. "Wait here. I'm going to make a copy of it and ask our lawyers to help. I think there's some way out. What do I care about your lawyers?" thought Fiona. "I've got one of those sitting at home. She can't even boil soup." The official vanished behind her door and Fiona had to wait again. Now she had to go to the bank. It was already 5 in the evening when she entered the premises. Beautiful, just like the administration office, but a little more modest. Here she was received much faster, and in 10 minutes she was already sitting in front of a young girl in a white shirt and glasses. Very pretty. "I wish my Vince had one of those." Fiona, and for some reason she began to blush. "She wouldn't call me Mom." The girl ran her eyes over the lawsuit, looked something up on her computer. Then she picked up the phone and called, but spoke so quietly that Fiona did not hear a single word, although she was sitting literally 2 meters away. Then the girl checked something on the computer again and looked at her visitor. "There is a way out, of course," she answered, "but you'd better talk to my management." Please go up to the 34th office on the second floor. Leanna sighed and rose from her chair. Her legs were aching from the constant moving. She had to go again, and she wasn't 18 anymore. She'd had children late. What could she do? On the other hand, she had plenty of strength, especially in the morning. If she had to, she could get Mike back on his feet by herself. The crew of that ill-fated boat was international. And Vince, it turns out, was the only dude on the boat. Or as they say abroad, Russian-speaking. He knew foreign languages well himself. Always said he could easily understand his own team. The easy character of a mechanic was so important on long voyages, where people are locked in small cabins for months. "We speak the language of technology," Vince said with his perpetual smile. "Me and my boys are on the same page." The rest of them were Chinese, Indonesians, and other countries Fiona couldn't remember the names of. And since neither she nor her daughter-in-law spoke the language, there was no way to communicate with their families. They both wanted to know if there was any news, if their loved one was all right. Together with Tina, they tried to search the internet for any information about the hijacking, but found nothing. Vince's phone was silent, too, although his messengers were working. Together, they had gone to various officials and had heard from them at first condolences and sympathy, then threats. Especially when they turned to the police with a statement about the missing person. That same evening, a man called Fiona's phone and she didn't like the conversation. Besa Tsumange in Russian. Some man who identified himself as a major swore into the phone. "We'll get them back. We will save your son and your husband. No amateurishness, no going to the police. Wait for further instruction. Maybe if Fiona were younger, if she had a lot of work and things to do, it would be easier for her. But as it was, she lived only for her son and grandson, going through every watch with him. Anxious waiting literally wore out her soul. With all this could be put up with for a while, if it were not for the prospect of being on the street. Ever since she was a child, she had been taught that a person should have a home. Out there in the West, you could live your whole life in a rented apartment or in a trailer. In Africa, under the scorching tropical sun, you can dig a dugout or hide in a pub. Your own living space is a cult. And Fiona also practiced this religion. One time, a shipping company representative got in touch with them. He was very apologetic about his language, though his speech was excellent. He only asked which account to transfer the money. Fiona was very happy. Tina gave her details, confident that the bank would sort it out. They'd transferred a small amount of money to her once and then forgotten about it. They must have thought they were in the clear. Fiona had one son and two daughters. When Vince grew up and bought an apartment, she sold hers immediately. She split the money equally between the kids and moved in with her son. Tina may not have liked it, but she didn't show it. The apartment is large, nice, 3 rooms. However, when Mike was born, her grandmother's help came in handy. Now Fiona thought she'd been a fool to sell her apartment. She was a nobody here, just a tenant with a stamp in her passport. Yeah, she still had the summer house. When Vince was at the beach, when the family needed to be left alone, she could get out of town. And when Mike got older, she could take him with her. But now they're being asked to pay or leave. What's she gonna do? She can't live at the cottage. Although winters here are warm, not so warm that you can do without hot water and a radiator. And she didn't have any of that at the dacha. She didn't have it. She didn't earn it. She spent it all on her Vince and her daughters. And boredom there at the dachas. No stores, no playgrounds. Going away with my daughter. Kate and Vivi would love to take her in, but they're young, no husbands, no children. What if she stops them from building their own happiness, their own families? No, she belongs here, back home. She has to wait for Vincent and help her son and grandson to go up to the second floor. The same polite and serious girl escorted her to the door and opened it with her card. Fiona wasn't thrilled with such high technology. If she lost her card, how would she get in? It's kind of like a factory on the second floor. Only here, they don't make cell phones, sew clothes, or pour Licos into jars to roll them into canned food. Big people were making money. Things were probably going well because the floors, walls, and ceilings had been renovated very well. Fiona looked at her shoes. Clearly, you could ruin the interior by walking in such cheap and dirty shoes. There was paneling on the walls as if mahogany had been used. The floor had expensive tiles of enormous size like marble. One of the doors was already open, and a man, not at all like the boss, was standing near it. Tight, fresh, in a neat suit. He greeted the visitor with a nod of his head and motioned for her to come. In this office, Fiona felt her financial insolvency even more acutely. She wanted to sit on a chair in the corner, but the man pulled out a chair and gestured for her to sit down. "It's beautiful here," the woman said. She almost forgot why she had come. "It's like a museum." "Thank you," the man replied. "It is customary to address employees by their first names. You can just call me Adrian." Fiona said, and the man in the nice jacket smiled. Yes, Fiona, I'm aware of that. Let's not waste any time. I'm fully immersed in your briefcase." "Immersed in what?" The woman interrupted him. She really wanted the expensive man in the expensive jacket to speak in words familiar to her. "I know all the details of the situation," he explained. "That the borrower has disappeared, your son, and I can only express my regrets. Can you not evict him from the apartment?" Fiona asked. "That's what I'm talking about." He nodded again. "We can give you credit vacations, and we can cancel the debt, but we need a court order to do that." A what? There was hope in my grandmother's soul. Don't make me say it out loud, he asked, because I have a hard time with words like that. Fiona didn't understand anything. Why was this handsome man speaking in riddles? Somehow she didn't believe that he could feel sympathy for her. He who sits near big money eventually becomes gold himself. "Oh, I can take it," the woman said stubbornly. "Okay," Adrian nodded. "You apply to the court on the recognition of your son dead." What do you mean dead?" said the woman, devastated. "He's not dead. That's what I'm talking about," the man replied. He seemed glad his guest hadn't fainted. Fiona sighed. Why did they all want her son Vince to be declared dead? The banker and Tina, he's not dead, she can feel it. He's just in trouble, he needs help, and they're burying him alive. It was hard for her to imagine something like that. What would happen when Vince came back? "It's the only workable option," Adrian said. "Then we can make a deal. The administration will go." "What if I don't agree?" Fiona asked. "If I believe that my son will come back, alive and well." He and eyes expressed sincere sympathy. She had never seen such handsome bosses before, and how polite he was. Couldn't he just cancel the debt so that neither Fiona nor her grandson would end up on the street? "If you don't agree, then this conversation never happened," he said after a long silence. "You understand? My bosses won't give me a hard time. If they find out that I'm giving advice here, please think about it, and I have to get back to my duty." The call from the district administration took Tina by surprise. She, a modest lawyer from a small company, did not understand the message or its purpose. She had been invited to the administration to deliver a message in person. Why would she spend 2 hours on a shuttle bus to hear something that couldn't be said over the phone? "Hello," said a woman's voice, seemingly devoid of emotion. "You and Fiona have been asked to appear before the head of the public relations department tomorrow to discuss your husband. Has he done something wrong?" Tina asked anxiously. "Probably not," the voice replied. "But I can't say for sure." "No, what about him? We don't know." The woman sighed, and some emotion flickered in her voice. Unfortunately, is he alive?" Tina asked. "According to our information, yes," answered the voice, and did not allow to continue questioning. "If you come to us tomorrow, we can find out a little more. Understand, you don't say these things over the phone." The most frustrating thing was that she was never told anything concrete. "You have to go to the reception, and that's it." Therefore, she was skeptical about the proposal to go to the district administration. Why, when she had enough to do? Vincent was alive, hadn't done anything wrong, so everything was all right. He'd be home soon. But when her agitated mother-in-law returned after the reception, it was as if the world had turned upside down. Vince had been taken hostage or captured by saboteurs or pirates, some kind of ransom demand, but not from them. The amount is unknown, but it's enormous, the kind of money they can't raise on their own. The uncertainty in which the young woman found herself was simply boundless. Tina could not believe for a long time that it was not an evil joke or a stupid place on the internet. And on television, there are only jokes. It's like people have lost the ability to be serious. Her Vince, the flight mechanic, became a hostage. It sounded as fantastic as if she'd won $1 million in the lottery. Theoretically, maybe, but it better not be true. Oh, what a cross, Fiona said. She told me the truth. Ooh. I believe it, Mom, I believe it, Tina replied. In fact, she had her doubts. The conversation with her mother-in-law had made her see things differently. That day, Tina was filled with a thirst for activity. She wanted to shout her distress, to ring all the bells. But Fiona convinced her it was better to keep quiet. There were risks. What could she get from her Vincent? If he was to be ransomed, it would be money she didn't have. But as the months passed, and the second and third, Tina began to realize that she was getting used to the absence of her husband. At first, there was a wound in her soul, then an emptiness that she tried to fill with memories, how they'd gotten to know each other, started dating, and then lived together. Vince, 10 years older, her first and only love, and the way he'd courted her. They met in St. New York. Tina was born and raised there, and Vince was there for some training to get a higher position. He came up to her on the street and spoke to her, smiling. Maybe in his small coastal town that was the custom, but in New York, it was a rare thing. He'd asked her out for wine, not coffee, and their affair had begun. That same evening, Vince asked her out for a walk along the waterfront. He gave her a place and time and told her not to be late. And when she showed up for her date with a tall, smiling man, he suggested they go up on a boat. Turns out Vince had rented it, and he drove it as well as he drove a car. It's a nice car, her husband to be explained. Very easy to drive. Navigation's great, look at this. Do you want to try it? Vince talked a lot of smart words about speed, displacement, comparing the boat to the competition. Tina couldn't say she liked the look of it, but she was impressed. It took them only 2 weeks to fall in love with each other. He had a place in her heart, and what had happened couldn't be considered a romance between a young man from out of town and a local princess. When Vince left for his hometown, she knew they'd see each other again. And so they did. He'd gone on long voyages, traveled the length and breadth of the earth, but he'd always come back. He was gone for months, but when he came back, he belonged only to her. And to spend as much time together as possible, they moved to his homeland. In a small southern town by the sea, they rented an apartment and got married. She found a job, even in her specialty, not dusty at all. True, she was not offended not only by the duties, but also by the large salary. With the money Vince brought back from his trips, they lived happily ever after. Then, a couple years later, Mike was born, and the family was complete. Though Tina had hoped that her husband would quit his voyages and find a job ashore, nothing of the sort happened. Vince lived the sea, dreamed of it. He knew the elements like a whale. He could look up at the sky and tell when it was going to rain, how long a storm would last. There was no other man like him on earth. You're the only one like you in the whole world, he told her. I'm lucky to have you, waiting for me like the wind in the calm. You know I'll definitely come back. Thanks to the internet, even the longest separation became bearable. They could communicate, if not every night, then several times a week. Vince told Misha stories from across the ocean, scolded him if he refused to eat, and he sent pictures and videos that took his breath away. But then Vincent disappeared, and no one could shed any light on the mystery of his disappearance. It must be that if her husband had been assigned to a Russian port, she could have gone somewhere, complained, demanded something. But as it was, even the owner of the ship was far away. Mike grew up without a father. Her meager salary was enough only for the bare necessities. Every day she called her mom and sobbed into the phone about how hard it was. Tina, her mom would say, drop everything and come back. You'll be here waiting for your sailor, but what can you do? At home, the walls help. Mom, my home is here. What about our apartment? Tina asked. All that money we invested. Oh, Tina, you can't bring a house to New York, Mom said. You're a grown woman and you know what to do. The apartment was a real shame. This house was obviously not built for the locals, but for those who wanted to have a comfortable residence by the sea. And more money had been invested here than in an average apartment in New York. A beautiful architecture, comfortable layouts, a front entrance, which was called in the Western manner, the lobby. Tina, her mother said into the phone, I told you right away that marriage to a sailor is a lottery, but you don't listen to anyone. Mom, don't start our way. You know what to do. If you want to come back, we're waiting. And she did know. She may not be a good lawyer, she may not be an outstanding one, But the solution was self-evident. She could sell the apartment with the bank's permission, pay off the debt, which was not even half of the market price, and return to her home, build a career, eventually forget Vince, and start a new family. But how do you decide to do that? The waiting had devastated Fiona. At 63, she was already retired, but she still worked. In one store, doing cleaning, scrubbing floors, and in the second, gluing stickers on products. They even put that funny word in the... Fiona worked so hard not only because her pension was modest, like everyone she knew in this town. She just couldn't sit in one place. She had to keep moving. Vincent was the same, and it seemed Mike had picked up their energy gene. Though Fiona didn't tell anyone about her trouble, word spread quickly through the town. Some even offered to raise money, but the proud woman refused. Vince is alive. Vince is alive. She'd tell her friends if they were too far apart in their pessimistic predictions. He'll be back. I've dreamed it. It was at times like this that Fiona was wrong. She didn't really remember dreams. She'd been making them up for as long as she could remember. So if Vince visited her, even if he tried to say something to her in the dark world, she couldn't remember it in real life. Fiona, any news? Nellie, her worst friend in the very store where Fiona was cleaning. No, Fiona answered. As soon as it's clear, you'll be the first to know. And there were those who spread the ugliest rumors. That Vince had left his wife, child, and mother to live in Australia. I'd seen his account on an English social network and almost talked to him. And that his name was no longer Vince, but William, or that her son, the purest of souls, was in an African prison. Drugs or guns, but betrayed by his own crew. As her friends recounted these rumors floating around town, Fiona wanted to howl with grief. In fact, it could very well be true. After all, she hadn't heard from her son in almost 6 months. When Fiona imagined the kidnappers, for some reason she thought they were pirates, and that they lived on an island. With, a deep cove that you can't see from this, and that they had a whole village with a separate cage where the slaves were kept. And there's Vince, surrounded but not broken. He walks around the cage, turns in circles, looks his captors in the eye and says, "Oh, you're lying, you can't take him." And they're so scared of him, they can't even let him go. In this picture of the pirate world, fit the fact that for several months the mysterious kidnappers did not even let her son make a call or at least send news to his family. The thought that pirates could be so inhumane made Fiona sick to her stomach. Fiona had spent her whole life in her town and knew everyone here. So when she sat at her second job in the evening and pasted stickers on some boxes of Chinese toys, she wasn't too surprised at Semyonova. She was not young either, but she was fresher than Fiona. She was 57 or 58 years old. She and Semyonova weren't really friends. They just said hello if they met each other on the street or in the store. "My Fiona," said the postmistress from the doorstep. "Phew, what is it?" Fiona wondered. "Boy, a letter, a real letter. Oh, from where?" Fiona jumped up from her chair, and the sudden rise made her lower back ache. "Oh, I know where from. Africa," Sandra replied. "Did you bring it?" Fiona asked and felt tears running down her cheeks against her will. It was the waiting, the longing. "You brought it here, didn't you?" "No, of course not," said the postmistress. "What are you doing?" "It's registered mail. It should be handed over at the post office if you show your passport." Here's the thing. The letter came to an address. The recipient is not listed there. So what? What? Fiona asked. It means that the letter can be received by anyone of legal age who lives at that address, as long as they have a registration. "You've got a registration? Haven't you, friend?" Fiona wanted to say that Sandra's soul was a manual, but she decided not to spoil relations with the messenger, who might well bring good news. She just sighed, adjusted her sweater, and checked her passport in her bag. Here it was, sitting in the secret compartment, along with a $5,000 bill. Like any grandmother, Fiona always carried her passport in her bag, for a reason known only to old people. "Okay, let's go," Fiona said. "I'll finish the stickers afterward. It's okay, no one's going to die." "Let's not go, we'll run," Sandra corrected her. "The branch closes in half an hour. Then that's it. No more letters, no more mail. We'll be there in time." In another situation, Fiona would have been amused by the postmistress's zealousness in following instructions. But she herself wanted to run away. The waiting was so tedious. She would have sprinted if it hadn't been for her age and chronic joint pain. There was light at the end of the tunnel, and she wanted to catch at least a small ray of warmth. The sea was not an element, but life. Maybe his unbridled passion for sailing was due to his complete lack of seasickness. Even in the worst storms, even in the most violent rocking, Vince kept a clear and bright head. He didn't get sick. He didn't lose his mind like dozens of other sailors he'd met along the way. He even gloated when a crewman, a particularly impressionable one, began to weep with fear. The storm was just making Vince feel better, not scaring him. "If you're so scared, why did you go out to sea?" he asked. "You could have sat on the beach and thrown your fishing rod in the water." Life on land was another matter. He wasn't comfortable here. Vince didn't understand many people, and he was bored on shore. Good thing he was lucky to have a wife. She knew how to wait. She knew how to support and inspire. Everything else didn't work out so well. When he was renovating, they tried to cheat him out of prices. First on the apartment, then on building materials and furniture. And he couldn't even argue with them. Good thing Tina wasn't like that. She immediately took the initiative and put in place those who tried to deceive him. Destroyed by some norms, quotes, threatened with instances, but in the right place. A lawyer, what can I say? The next flight, at first glance, was no different from the previous ones. And yet it was special, unique, just as the sea was never the same. Vincent did not expect the ship to be captured by black militants. He didn't see the most intense part of the performance, the capture. While he sat in the engine room, the roar of the engines blocked out any noise outside, and then he was followed by his own, a Briton Peter, whom Vince called Pete. The mechanic was surprised at his colleague. They worked in shifts, and today was not his day. "Turn it off." "Come on," he said in English. "We've been captured." Vince thought he had misunderstood his comrade. He carefully shut down the engine, checked the instruments and gauges. "Everything's fine." "Oh, I'm sorry. What happened?" "Captured," replied the Brit. "The terrorists you call pirates are on board, just as they were 200 years ago. They snuck up in their dinghies, ran onto the bridge. We had no time to open our mouths." "Why didn't the captain give the command to kill the engine?" Vince asked. "Why did he send you?" "Those savages took him off the bridge. They don't even know how to use the comms." "Relax, that's not the worst of it. After all, they didn't fire a single round at us. Yeah, there can't be a mistake." The entire crew, all 30 of them, were standing on deck. The only time they all got together was on shore, before the launch. And on the way everyone has his own task, they have no time to stand in a single line, and here they are. Only instead of an employer, they were armed men in masks. All of them were thin, if not to say skinny, but they held their automatic rifles tightly, even if they didn't point them at the team. "No need for heroism," the captain said to his men. The pirates had tied his hands for some reason. "We will proceed according to protocol." The capture was different from what Vince had seen in the movies. No one shouted or fired. The pirates were calm, even casual. Most of the crew were locked up, but the chief flight engineer and Vince were sent back to the engine room. The invaders were not very good with machinery. One of the skinny, dark-haired guys took over, his mask off his lips and his eyes still closed. "Let's do something," Vince suggested when they were back to their usual work. "We can't do this." "Relax," Peter replied. "They're not going to do anything to us. Just follow their commands. There are only 5 of them." Vince resented them. "There are 30 of them. They've got machine guns," the Brit said firmly. "You dudes don't know how to look at a situation soberly. You want to show who's boss. Trust me, and you'll be home in a month," he agreed. But when they went upstairs and saw the pirate in the mechanics things, Vince's indignation was boundless. The masked man was wearing his tactical pants and vest, which he'd recently bought at the port for a decent sum. Not only were they beautiful, but they were brand new. He wanted to go fishing in them. Peter saw Vince heading toward the masked corsair and grabbed his shoulder. "Relax," the Brit said. "It's close. You have a wife and son waiting for you at home. I'm convinced that by the end of the month you'll be able to see them and hug them." 6 months passed. Vince tried to figure out how it was that he was the only one of the crew left with the pirates. It must have started the day after he'd bailed out the pirates for the first time. Almost the entire crew, except for 4 men, were loaded into dinghies and sent to the old bark. Their 5 more dark-skinned pirates were waiting for them. As the boats sailed away from their home ship, Vince was glad for the good weather. It was just their luck that the water was calm today. They would have capsized in a heartbeat if there had been any rough seas. The diesel engines could hardly pull the boats. One way or another, they reached the pirate schooner, which was also living out its last days. After only an hour's journey, the longboat stood up. Vincent could hear by the sound of it that the engine was out of order. He was accustomed to thinking of machinery as music. This engine was clearly faltering, failing. The pirates began to swear, and at one point almost started shooting at each other. But then one of them, the oldest, with a real bandage on his face, fixed his one eye on the captured crew. Technician, he said in broken English. EIF fix. Who? Vince took a step forward. If they were to be captured, it was better to swim to shore than to drift endlessly in the vast ocean. He went down to the engine room and tinkered with the engine for several hours before it came to life. The dark-skinned pirate, who was in charge of the machinery, wanted to add speed, but Vince slapped him on the palm of his hand. The invader grinned like a beast and went for the mechanic. "You what?" he said, snatching up the knife. "Don't you need a hand?" But at that moment, the one-eyed pirate, the oldest looking, grabbed the troublemaker by the shoulder and playfully threw him to the floor. He must have had a lot of strength to stop the young and tall man with such ease. The old pirate said a few words to his young companion, who grinned once more and left. How long is it?" Vince asked. 50 miles. The one-eyed corsair answered in a terrible accent. "Can we make it?" Vincent nodded. "We'll make it." Fiona held the letter in her hand and smiled stupidly with excitement. It was definitely from Vince. Well done. He'd found a way to send word to his family. The envelope looked as if it had traveled halfway around the world before reaching their seas. There were so many stamps on it that there was hardly any space left. On the letter, stamps with exotic images, tropical fruits, animals, rulers in African national costumes. Fiona didn't bother to open the envelope. She thought it was a great chance to repair her relationship with her daughter-in-law. They'd read the happy news together, find out when Vince was coming home, and they'd get on well like old times and be sure to sort out the bank and other problems. "Tina, are you home?" Fiona asked her daughter-in-law, dialing her number on the phone. They had rarely dialed each other lately. "Yes," the young woman answered. "What's wrong?" "There's a letter here." Again, Tina said, confused. "Where did it come from this time?" "No, it's a different letter." Fiona's optimism was overflowing. "It's African. If you're home, I'll be right there. We'll take a look at it together." "I haven't opened it yet." "I want you to open it, Tina." Mike was concentrating for the umpteenth time on assembling his logging truck. It was his favorite toy. Dad had bought it at a stall when they'd been out together on his last shore vacation. Instead of a cab, for some reason, it had a cat's head. The toy makers from the Celestial Empire must have put some meaning into it, which is not fully understood by a Russian person. But Mike was fine with it. A cat's head on a logging truck. That's the way it should be. "You open the door," Tina suggested. "You have a lucky hand." Fiona wanted to ask her daughter-in-law to call her you again. Yes, she'd overreached and even broken it. She'd been too hard on her daughter-in-law all these months. But they can make up and live in harmony again. It just takes a small thing, a little bit of certainty, so that they know when to expect the return of their husband, son, and father. "No, darling, you open it," Fiona said. It's your husband, so I have to move." A mother's share is small. She bore him, gave birth, led him into the world. And then the wife is responsible. Tina opened the envelope in excitement, unfolded the letter, but the joyful expectation on her face was suddenly replaced by surprise and then indignation and anger. After reading, the girl folded the letter and grabbed the letter as if she wanted to tear it, but changed her mind. Tina looked gloatingly at her mother-in-law and handed her the paper. Here, she said. Look at it." Fiona took the paper. The language of the letter seemed to be Russian, but at first she read and reread it, unable to understand a word. Or rather, the general meaning came to her, but she refused to believe it. Mike assembled the car and decided to see what his mother and grandmother were doing. The little boy went up to Fiona, took her hand, and burped. "Bah, Is it 100? Oh, Mike. Oh, Grandma, read it, asked the little boy. Fiona gave in and began to read the letter aloud. We regret to inform you that Vincent Yen, an employee of Transaf United, has violated the terms of his contract and has been out of contact for several months. The dry cargo ship with crew along with Vincent Yen was captured on 10/5/2021. The company took exhaustive measures to search for and recover Vincent Yen, the onboard mechanic, the remaining crew member. By the time of the hijacking, the vessel under his command was traveling with its transponder turned off. According to information received from the Moroccan Special Police, Vincent Yen is not in captivity and his whereabouts have been approximated. In view of this information, the contract has been terminated. For final payments, please contact the company's Morocco office at Grandma, I don't get it. I don't understand, Mike said. He, like all small children, could repeat the same phrase dozens of times. Oh, come here, little boy, Tina said. Come here, I'll show them all, Fiona shouted. I'll go to Andean tomorrow. No, the present, you can go higher than that, grinned her daughter-in-law. You should make an appointment with the Almighty. At your age, I will not tolerate blasphemy in my house. Fiona said loudly, and Mike started crying again. But Tina didn't escalate the conflict. She took her son and went into the other room. Fiona thought she really should go to church, and the sooner the better. Without his intercession, this show definitely wouldn't get sorted out. Their motley crew was divided immediately by nationality. Peter and Vince ended up in the same room. It's hard to say whether their room was better or worse than the others. Instead of beds, there were mattresses lying on the bare ground. Instead of a table, there was a large blackboard on which flies and other insects that the sailor had only seen in biology textbooks crawled. The hut might have looked like the dwelling of a local poor man if it had not been for the bars. The bars were on both the windows and the doors. Vince glanced warily at the wires that ran along the wall. If their little prison caught fire, they could hardly escape. There was no restroom. Twice a day, the locals came in with machine guns and took them outside. I told you there was no need for heroics, Peter reflected. As you can see, we are not going to be killed. The living conditions are quite tolerable. We just have to be patient. Soon you and I will return to our native countries and we will remember this story with a smile. Good for you, said Vince. You have no wife and no children. You might be able to smile your British smile. I've got people waiting for me at home. Relax, William. It's an insurance claim. You'll get paid a lot of money and you'll tell your kids about being captured by pirates. It's $1 million story. Vince thought to himself that his countrymen didn't get into this kind of trouble very often. When he came back, he'd be interviewed or even made into a movie. But when will that be? His picture is probably already on the news on every federal channel. How much money do these dark-skinned guys need to release him? After 2 days of waiting, a TV was put in their room. Otherwise, they would have just started howling with longing. But all the content is in an unfamiliar language. Not even a single channel in English. It was still more fun to hear other people's speech than to talk to each other endlessly. We're going to lose weight on this food, said Peter, as they were brought their meager rations again. But on the other hand, at least it's something like this. They were fed twice a day. A woman handed them 2 bowls of baked beans through the bars. In principle, Vince had nothing against such a dish. It was good, but if it was all he had to eat, the beans quickly became disgusting. The only thing that kept him going was his partner, who didn't seem to be discouraged. William, Peter said, maybe you could teach me Russian. I'll come out of here a great translator and find myself a new job. Without the bloody sea. The sea after his wife and son. It was the biggest thing Vincent longed for. It was close enough to reach. In the mornings, he breathed the salty air. And if the village was quiet, he could hear the water rippling. He wished he knew where they were and how far they'd gotten from civilization. On the 3rd night, when they turned off the TV and went to bed, he was awakened an hour later. Get up, let's go. You're a job. A contract, said the stranger. Vincent sleepily sent the pirate to hell, but he didn't understand English very well, or pretended to. The dark-skinned man who'd come after him was denser than his countrymen, and his arms were a good relief of muscle. The stranger was smiling, confirming the stereotype that Africans had the whitest teeth on earth. He could use them instead of a flashlight. When they had been brought to the village, they had been blindfolded while still on the schooner. Now at night, one of the kidnappers either didn't care about privacy or hoped that the darkness would keep the village safely hidden. But something could still be seen in the darkness. They were in a large village, and they were walking along a road that was good by local standards. It was here, and there were off-road vehicles, mostly Japanese. Vince knew that in Africa, they valued Toyota and other brands that were easy to repair and reliable for aggressive use. To the left, in the distance, was a dark building. Some signs of the buildings were different. Some small huts in front, but on the second line were quite large houses. "Call me Beat. Hurry up and step forward." "Beat," said the pumped-up pirate, following close by. "You know where you're going," Vincent replied. "We heard you were fixing it. We need to fix the boat. Go forward quickly. It's very important." "Step, you fix the boat," or out of boredom than any real desire to help, Vince obeyed the black man. He led him to a hangar where a large boat with a disassembled motor stood on a carriage. The mechanic took a flashlight, took a quick look at the machinery, and whistled. Someone must have tried to repair the engine blindfolded, and it was in an absolutely terrible condition. The wiring on the boat also left much to be desired. "You could burn yourself out if a miracle happened and the engine started?" "Can you do it?" Beat asked. "I doubt it," Vincent replied. He wanted to explain that for such a repair he needed time, desire, and most importantly, parts. But he thought it was a waste of time. Pirates didn't understand English very well. "You can do it." Beat nodded. "Over there, tools. That's where the gears are. Your brother will be with you all night. He'll help you." "I don't want to," Vincent breathed out. "Mistake." Beat shook his head and pointed to the gun on his belt. "You fix it. I don't shoot." "Not you, not my friend." The deal. Sometimes Tina went to her page on the world's most popular social networking site. She'd scroll through the feeds, look at other people's stories of happy families to forget herself. Now and then men tried to get to know her. They wrote something in private messages, called her for coffee with far-reaching consequences. All this verbal garbage she threw away without reading, but the first and last name of one of the men seemed familiar. I think Vincent had told her about him. Besides, the man hadn't asked for coffee, but had written a large message in English. At least one name was immediately apparent: Vincent, only in Peter Long, her husband's partner. She stared at the photo. That was him, and in one photo in the album, it was him and Vince, hugging like cronies. Tina didn't understand English very well. She'd wanted to learn it when she was carrying Mike, but the pregnancy had been too difficult for her so she copied the Brit's words into a Google translator and tried to grasp the general meaning. She wanted to believe that she had misunderstood her interlocutor, or that he was mistaken, deceiving her. "I am a friend of Vincent, your husband," Peter wrote. "I had a hard time finding your page. I understand that it's normal for a husband and wife to have different last names, but the fact that his page is missing from your friends is nonsense. Fortunately, my luck has changed. Please reply as William asked me to tell you that he misses his family very much. Is he alive?" She wrote, "No, yes," the Brit replied. "William is alive and well, only complaining about his teeth. The water is disgusting. He missed you very much, remembered every day. We were separated when we were held prisoner for a few days. Why didn't he come back?" Tina asked, trying to find the right words. "He's working with them," the Brit replied. How's that?" "Look, Daddy, it's hard to explain," he continued. "I just wanted to say that we are praying for him and for you. There is a way we can help financially. Please let me know how we can do that." "Thank you," Tina wrote. "But what is it like to work with them? Can you explain?" "Me? I've already told the police everything," Peter replied. "I'm afraid it's a job for them." Tina closed the social networking app, unable to bear the bitter truth. Working with them. Then I can see why it's taking him so long to come home. And also why she and her mother-in-law were expected to keep quiet and find out nothing. Her husband's a pirate. Her husband hijacks other people's ships. It just didn't make sense. Tina didn't bother to tell her mother-in-law anything. She could see the uncertainty hitting the woman. She had always seemed younger than her years, and now she had aged dramatically. Let someone else tell her such news. Now, in order not to lose the apartment, it was necessary to act. Tanya's soul was filled with contradictory feelings. On the one hand, she loved Vince, the father of her child, so cheerful and optimistic. He was a real energy, a nuclear reactor that never shut down. His confessions were so naive, but so sincere. No one knows his fate, but she wanted to believe that he would get out of it, that he would make it. On the other hand, she was so young, maybe her husband will come back. Not now, but in 2 years, 5 years, or 10? Tina tried to understand herself. If Vince, God forbid, were suddenly in prison, would she wait for him? She would, but not forever. But prison is one thing, captivity is another. Of course, he works for African criminals, not of his own free will. That's even worse. When there's a trial and a sentence, you can know exactly when the sentence is over, when the person is going to go back to freedom. They had taken criminal law in law school, so Tina knew that you could only be in prison for a very long time if you did something truly horrible. But prison was like incarceration without a sentence. All the more frustrating because Vince had done nothing wrong, betrayed no one, or done anything wrong. It must be that all these big men just don't know how to negotiate. The pirates let go whoever they paid for or put in a good word. And her husband was too easy a man, too convenient and suave to lay down his bones for him. What would Vince say if she decided not to wait for him? Would he let her continue to make her own destiny and even find Mike another father? Or would he have gotten angry, yelling and cursing? She knew her husband well, even perfectly, but she could not predict his behavior at such a difficult fork in the road. The atmosphere in the apartment was electrifying. Both Tina and Fiona tried to spend as little time together as possible, and both felt shame, but for different reasons. That feeling faded, though, when they had to get back to the important issues on which the future depended. Not just theirs, but Mike's. So you're with them too? My mother-in-law questioned. And you want my Vince to be declared dead while he's still alive? They put Mike in the living room to watch cartoons while they argued in the kitchen. Fiona couldn't accept the reality of her old age. She'd never been to court in her entire life. She'd never been taken to the police. It seemed to her something shameful, disgusting, reprehensible. We'll just buy time, Tina persuaded her. Let's say he's declared dead. It could be overturned if Vince came back. Otherwise, we'll be evicted. Let them try. F, Fiona replied defiantly. AEI, Huron replied defiantly. Mike and I have places to go. Her daughter-in-law continued. We're going to my mom's in New York. What about you? No one's going to evict me, daughter, Fiona said. But she sounded less sure. You can't evict a man if he has nowhere else to go. I'm a pensioner, an invalid, almost an honored man. Here, of course, Fiona was lying. Although she went to the doctors regularly, her health was excellent for her age. There was no way that argument was going to hold up. Besides, she knew how hard it was to get disability, even if you were really unwell. But she believed that the court was a place that would help, not evict. Especially if she just didn't have another place to live. That's not an option, Tina said. I'm a lawyer. Our apartment is mortgaged, so even Mike won't be spared. The law is the law. It can't be. Well, Fiona, why are you arguing? The young woman waved her hands. Would I tell you this if I didn't know for sure? Will they kick me out? Fiona said in disbelief. They'll evict you before you know it, continued the daughter-in-law. I won't fight to the death for this apartment. I feel sorry for her, of course, but health is more expensive. Tina had already decided for herself that she would not humiliate herself and argue with the bailiffs. If they suddenly evict her, she'll pack her things and leave. All the more, her mom is waiting. But it was worth fighting the system, especially since she saw one way to win, and she didn't want to go back to New York. It's cold and it rains all the time. She liked living by the sea. She'd gotten used to it over the years, and she couldn't imagine herself anywhere else. On the one hand, everyone in this town knows about her personal tragedy, that her husband disappeared or became a pirate. Out there, in the big city, she could just get lost. Here, everyone knows to leave and be done with it. And this cheerful old woman, if she wants to fight to the death, she can. At least, she didn't go to Andy I. It turns out he doesn't broadcast anymore. I don't agree, Fiona said. I'm not signing up for anything. Vince is alive, I can feel it. And he'll be back, Tina sighed. She had already prepared a statement asking for her husband to be declared dead. As her fingers raced across the keyboard, tears rolled down her cheeks. But there was no other choice. This way, at least she could stall for time to get at least some payments for the child, for the loss of the breadwinner. If you're not going to leave, at least clean more often, Tina said. I do all the cooking and cleaning, and the windows could use some cleaning. Look how you're bossing me around. You're not the boss, Fiona said angrily. This is my son's apartment. What if he's— Tina sighed. The words were hard to say. What if he's no longer alive? You wish, Fiona said. You can't wait for him to die. But even if he is gone, part of it belongs to me. I know my rights well. You're wrong, said Tina. Vincent wrote a will. A will. Fiona's eyes widened. Yes, her daughter-in-law nodded. I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want you to think I was trying to get this apartment on purpose. She wanted to say more harsh words, but Fiona suddenly sank back into her room. Fiona knew that in her favorite soap operas at such moments, the heroes usually fainted and an ambulance rushed to them. She, on the other hand, felt fine. Despite her worries, only her soul hurt. But modern medicine doesn't know how to treat that. William, where have you been? Peter asked. I was worried. Vince grinned. So worried, in fact, that he'd been sleeping like a marmot when the pirate had taken him out at night. By morning, the mechanic had managed to revive the engine at great cost. But of course it wouldn't last long. I don't care. Let these pirates go out to sea and stall. This is the second time I've been kidnapped, Vincent explained. I was up all night resurrecting a half-dead boat. Black magic, Peter laughed. He was glad that the dude was still optimistic, no matter what. But the fact that his colleague had agreed to help the pirates was alarming. Unless William is a grown man and knows what to do himself. Our Chinese friends are on the loose, said Peter. The woman who brings us the slop called food explained it to me in broken English sign language. Good for them, said Vince. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to bed. Sure, Peter nodded. I'll turn the TV down. Just kidding, I'll turn it all the way down, man. That was the last time Vincent saw his British colleague. After lunch, two skinny black guys with smiles that could compete with the lights came to pick him up. These knew no English at all and gestured to the mechanic where to go. He responded with another gesture, an international gesture, but had to comply. The African village is filled with stuffy and scorching air. Here and there were locals going about their business. Women were washing and peeling vegetables, children were playing and running around, men were lounging on large sun beds under umbrellas and drinking drinks from bottles. Clay-clad huts were neighbored by tall brick houses. No fences, all doors open. Palm trees overhung them. Vincent and his escorts reached the edge of the village. There, far away from the other houses, stood a villa that looked like a medieval castle. There was a fence around it, and a few other guys with machine guns, all of them with serious frowns on their faces. We went inside. After the heat outside, the air conditioning seemed like bliss. Let's be clear, said a swarthy man in plain English, sitting on a high leather armchair as if on a throne. They won't pay for you. What do you mean? Benson wondered. Who are you? I don't understand anything. You don't need to understand, replied the local king. I don't have time to explain. Nobody needs you, and you're not getting paid. But the boys said you've already helped us twice. Vincent didn't say a word. He didn't like the atmosphere or the conversation. One thing he was glad about was the air conditioning, which kept the room at a comfortable temperature. There was a table in front of the czar with fruit, cheese, and sweets. Vince stared at the food and swallowed saliva. The pirate followed his gaze and smiled. Eat something, keep your mouth busy, he said. The Chinese were bought at once. The British are being dealt with. But with you, sailor, there's a problem. What kind of trouble? Vince was surprised. I'm Russian. The Africans love us. We've helped everyone here so many times. Not everyone loves us, the pirate boss corrected him. It's business, you know. I'm wasting my time explaining things to you. Oh, I didn't ask to be kidnapped, Vincent said. I'm a mechanic. I don't decide anything. We can only keep you and feed you if you work for us, the king said and leaned toward him. You must earn your bread and your life. And if I don't? Vincent asked, filling his mouth with cheese and grapes. How he longed for a proper meal. Even the pirate's threats had less effect on him when his stomach was full. Oh, let's throw it into the sea. The king yawned. Let the sharks sort it out. Vince knew there were sharks here because the waters were very warm. He was also willing to believe that they'd refuse to pay for him as quickly as they'd refused to pay for the other crewmen. He'd heard of something like that before. It's just that when these stories are told over a beer, it's one thing. A huge, dark-skinned man making death threats for refusing to work is another. I got a family back home, Vince said. You'll work for me for a while. Buy yourself out, the kingpin explained. And then you'll leave. A contract. The will was Vince's idea, from start to finish. Tina didn't understand why he thought of such things at such a young age. But it would solve everything now. Relations with her mother-in-law were already strained to the breaking point. Sell the apartment, pay off the bank, and part like ships at sea. The only thing that made them hold back was Mike, who didn't want to get involved in adult problems. Tina caught herself thinking that she had already accepted the idea that she would have to leave the apartment, one way or another. Before, the feeling that she was the owner of the place gave her strength and energy. She used to scrub the floors and furniture tirelessly, cleaning almost every day, constantly decorating the place, buying new furniture. Now she was too lazy, even to dust the cupboards. Mom, let's clean. BAM, said Mike, holding his toy mop. He liked order. He remembered where and what toy he put where he left the car, and when Mommy scrubbed the floors or vacuumed, he'd come right over to help. To keep him interested in cleaning, he and Vince even bought him a toy mop. They're the happiest kids in the history of mankind. Not today, Mike, Tina said. Go play with the cars. I'm busy. What are you doing? My son asked. Working the woman's side. Tina was preparing for the trial. Both her and her mother-in-law would be summoned to the hearing. They would ask questions. They must have already requested information from the police, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She attached to the application a letter that had recently come from her employer. Most likely her husband will be declared missing. Then she will be able to get a delay from the bank, a credit vacation, or she would finally get help from the administration, not in word but in deed. Mom, when is Dad coming? Mike asked me. I don't know, Tina answered honestly. Does Grandma know? He continued. Who knows? You can't explain to such a small child that Daddy was in trouble somewhere far away, and that now the details of his fate, a real mystery. When he's older, she'll explain everything. He'd understand everything. Vincent found himself in a huge port city that looked like a junkyard. Ships were everywhere, on the dock, at the dock, or just washed ashore. He didn't even know roughly where they were. The Pirate King was traveling in a yacht, a beautiful one, but not the most luxurious Vincent had seen in his seafaring life. He was put under lock and key, and when he asked for the captain's bridge, one of the guards took up a pistol. Big Boss forbid it. He said sternly, You sit down, I don't shoot. It took the yacht 2 days to reach the port city. Her engine was inspected. It ran smoothly, beautifully like clockwork. And since Vince's services weren't in demand, he wasn't treated very well. He was fed only twice, and it looked like leftovers from the boss's table, but there wasn't much to choose from. Now the fact that he hadn't had time to say goodbye to Peter added to the sailor's list of pains. He had gone to meet his fate lightly in the clothes he had been captured in. In the harbor, though, things had gotten a little more comfortable. He was put on a huge repair dock where work was going on day and night. He was given overalls, underwear, flip-flops. Instead of a cabin, a container with 2 bunk beds. It was closely adjacent to the repair area. You could not go anywhere. The first 3 days were no different from his usual work. One was responsible for setting up the electronics, and the other did the hard physical labor of operating a gantry crane. The foreman, that's what he called himself, was obviously a free man. Most of the time he sat in a room on the mezzanine, locked up, and watched his team through the glass. He was only allowed to talk to him on business. To place an order for parts or tools, you had to ring the bell and wait for the master's indulgence. Vince would have loved to talk to the other 2 mechanics who worked at the dock, but they either didn't understand his English and Russian or pretended not to. At least once a week, Big Boss came to them to criticize the repair. Not a spoke to them in a different language. Not a single familiar word. And then he'd go to No, dude, shouted Big Boss in English. I'm not feeding you so you can rest here. The job has to be done by morning, you understand? Vincent sighed. He had to fix machinery all the time. He didn't have to sleep. His palms were already black with oil and his mind was dull. He didn't share the boss's complaints. The mechanic hadn't come across a single mechanism that he couldn't bring back to life. And the pirate's equipment was disgusting. Everything was outdated, worn out, and if it was serviced, it was by amateurs. Hoping was good. In the port city, he could find spare parts instantly. In the morning, the master would take a slip of paper where Vince had written the names of the parts he needed with a dirty hand. By lunchtime, or at the latest in the evening, he had the parts. The repair dock was also a makeshift parts warehouse. Someone had dismantled hundreds of machines and put the parts on the shelves, but they were in such disarray that it was difficult to find the right item. And since Vince saw no white light and the days were similar, he lost track of time. How long had he been a prisoner here? It felt like 3 or 4 months, but in reality, it could have been years. He had asked many times to call, to say a word to Tina or his mother, but the pirates had refused. Why do you want to leave? Big Boss asked with genuine bewilderment. Is it bad for you here with us? Oh, my wife and son are waiting for me at home, answered Vince. Work some more, the pirate urged. When you're a free man, we'll find you a new wife. She will bear you not 1, but a dozen sons. Vincent learned that the pirate business was not centered on hijacking ships. On the contrary, his new boss had convinced him that they would be moving away from that line of business. The sailor thought that the Tsar simply had no one to discuss his ambitious plans with. He didn't trust his partners, and he was afraid of other captives. He called Vince's friend every time, which didn't stop him from having regular debriefings. Smuggling is our future, he said. But we need reliable ships. And you, dude, you're too slow at repairing them. Too slow. I'm tired of watching you guys work all day long. So let me go, Vince said. No. You haven't done 1/10 of what you owe, Big Boss scolded. But if you do well, you'll not only be a free man, but a rich one. Vincent sighed and went to work. Here, in the African port city, he was completely disenfranchised, and the sea no longer seemed as desirable to him as it once had. It was close by. He was literally standing on it. All he wanted was to return home to his family and never be parted from her again. Tina wrote to Peter, who promised help, but his reply was disappointing. If she could pay off the bank, the huge sum for her must have been small money for a British man. Besides, he knew Vincent's other co-workers. Oh, we'll pay it all back, Tina wrote. I'm sure we will, Peter replied. But we'll have to think about it. It would take time to raise the money. Time was running out. In a week, the court, where the bank will ask to evict her from the apartment. Yes, she can appeal the decision and ask for a stay of execution, but none of that would solve the problem. It would be a few months, a year at the most, when the leverage would be gone. And Tina knew perfectly well that those who would want to take the apartment do not care about both children and mothers. Oh, if only he had somehow gotten in touch, she said. If he'd even let me know, I wouldn't have dared to do it. I would have waited. Don't make excuses. My mother-in-law replied sharply. Do whatever you want, Tina. I'm not going to get down on my knees in front of you. There was only one way left. If the court declared Vincent dead, the eviction proceedings would be suspended, and she'd have time to pay off her debt somehow, or she could pack up and go home to her mother. The night before the hearing, they didn't speak. Mike couldn't understand why the two people closest to him weren't talking. He tried to find something for them to do together, to ask them to play, but to no avail. You didn't have to come, Tina said when she saw her mother-in-law in front of the judge's office. Of course not. Fiona snapped at her. I don't want you saying anything. I'm not going to let them evict us. The eviction case is on hold, Tina sighed. They're going to hear my application today. If you're here, do as I say. But the mother-in-law stuck her nose up proudly and didn't say a word. The secretary checked their data, checked their passports, and told them to go into the hall. Tina felt confident. She had been to court before, but her mother-in-law was obviously uncomfortable. She was asking questions to the secretary, trying to find out something. What about the judge? Fiona asked. Was she angry or not? The secretary smiled and answered something neutral. Of course she is, thought Tina. You should have lived with her for the last year. I'd like to see you smile. They entered the hall, and within a couple of minutes, a judge in a robe took her place at the table. She was a woman of indeterminate age. She could be either 30 or 50. She, too, clarified their details, explained their rights, and got to the heart of the dispute. Or, "Do you support the application?" she asked the women. "Yes, Your Honor," Tina replied. "Absolutely not," shouted Fiona. The judge tapped her cue stick and admonished her. Fiona genuinely wondered, what had she done wrong? The woman in the robe shifted some papers and began to ask Tina questions. "What does it take to declare Vincent N. dead?" "Your Honor, we are in a difficult financial situation," Tina replied. Declaring him dead will allow us to receive survivors' benefits." "Oh, I see," the judge nodded. Fiona, clarify why you do not support the application." "Oh, because Vincent is alive." "Who?" answered the pensioner. "Oh, when was the last time you spoke to him?" "Or, a week ago." Fiona said defiantly. The judge looked at both women expressively. Tina sighed. The most frustrating thing is when the court starts to doubt the veracity of a statement. "I'll give it a week," she said. "There's a fortune teller by the sea." Tina went to her, not even thinking about the possible queue. At the fortune teller's house, there were mostly newcomers waiting, lazily lounging on benches. The woman counted 6 people and wanted to leave, but suddenly the door to the house opened, and the fortune teller appeared on the threshold. She looked at her clientele for a couple of seconds and pointed her finger at Tina. "Me," she said. The fortune teller nodded. Tina walked inside. No one shouted at her back that she had cut in line. Apparently, the laws of ordinary social life did not apply here. Although it was hot and sunny outside, inside in the herbalist's abode, it was dark and cool. There were icons on the walls, which seemed very strange to Tina. Candles burned in the room where the mysterious soothsayer received her clients. All the windows were covered with thick cloth. "Oh, what can I tell you, my dear?" he asked the fortune teller, playing cards. After these words, Tina suddenly began to cry. She felt sorry for herself and for Micah and for her mother-in-law, who was completely exhausted because of the disappearance of her beloved son. The fortune teller sighed, but waited patiently for her guest to pull herself together. "So what happened, sweetheart?" She repeated. "Oh, my husband," Tina began. "My husband was stolen." "Oh, it happens," the fortune teller shrugged. "Do you want me to do the reversal?" "No, he was stolen by men," Tina said. They stole it, you know. "I understand everything," the woman said. "I've been looking at people like you for years. I've been looking and looking and looking, noticing everything. What do you want, my son?" Tina hesitated. If the need brought her here, to the house of the most sought-after fortune teller by the sea, she should ask for something understandable, something that could be checked later. After the tears she'd shed, she suddenly felt funny. Maybe the fortune teller could give her the number of a lucky lottery ticket. "Oh, tell me," Tina said after a pause. "Tell me, is he alive?" The healer sighed and began to shuffle her deck. She laid the cards on the table, and the visitor looked at the images. She saw some man, knives and all. She wondered how she, a woman with a college degree, had decided to ask for help from some "He's alive," the fortune teller answered. "He is languishing inside a cage, either prison or captivity. Either a choice or a share. Is he well?" Tina asked. She suddenly realized what interested her most. The future, whether Vincent would come back to her, and then she could be patient, or he would be lost in a foreign land, and then any action she took would be justified. Oh, the fortune teller sighed. "Your husband is healthy, but not quite. He will live, but not as people do. He was sick, but he survived. Oh, will he come back to me?" Tina was finally able to ask the question that worried her the most. "Yeah, Vince is strong, that's for sure. Even if he were in trouble, weak and feeble, he wouldn't give up. He'd stay with her, cheer her up, and laugh at his own problems. But if he had been near her, and so, in a foreign land, it was unknown whether he would return on principle." The fortune teller suddenly put the cards away and turned on the light. Tina saw her office, not very presentable. There was trash in the corners, candy bar and chip packets, empty bottles. "Oh, what does your heart tell you?" the fortune teller asked. Tina thought again. Her heart seemed to be silent, that she hasn't asked it anything worthwhile in a long time, just living her life as if she were riding the rails. The The son, the mother-in-law, the mortgage in the bank, they're all kind of there, but they all pass over the surface. Is Vince coming back or not? That's when Tina realized she was waiting for him and still loving him. He's right there, she answered. Then go, the fortune teller said. Go and don't scare away my clientele. I can see that you are in trouble, real trouble. How can I help you? I did what I could. I did everything, and what I didn't do, I couldn't. And don't ask questions to the cards. Do you understand me? That morning, for some reason, the master and the two wordless workers were kicked off the docks. Vince was alone, except for the spy with the gun, but he didn't enter the dock. An hour later, Big Boss came in. He seemed kinder than usual today. He didn't even yell at his slave or try to speed him up. No, look, my beauty, said the pirate. The gates opened. Big Boss's yacht entered the repair dock carefully, very slowly. The black-skinned man put the vessel on its keel and brushed the sweat from his forehead. He bowed to the head pirate and jumped onto the bridge. The boss clapped his sidekick on the shoulder, approvingly. Keep it up. We need to check the technical part. Be as careful as with a woman, Big Boss told him. I won't trust my boat to anyone but you. No one will disturb you. Albert will watch and help you. A contract? Oh, give me the phone, the sailor asked. I need to call my wife. The connection doesn't work here, the boss said without blinking an eye. To make a call, you have to go out to sea. Behave well, and tomorrow we will go out together on my beauty. You'll call, I give you my word. The gates of the repair dock closed. Vincent was dead tired of waiting, of being away from his family, of working all the time. He decided it was time to take his fate into his own hands. If only Peter hadn't been so skeptical on the ship, they could have fought off the pirates and thrown them into the sea. Vincent was determined that he could handle one course. I'm on it, the mechanic replied and smiled. Big Boss took that as a sign of favor and clapped him on the shoulder as he had Albert. You guys are gold, said the pirate. You take a good look at the ship and tell me personally what needs to be repaired and what needs to be replaced. And don't discuss what you see with the master. I don't trust him. Together with Albert, Vincent went into the yacht and went down into the engine room. The boat was in excellent condition. It was obvious that the machinery had been serviced by specialists. Only minimal work was required to keep the yacht in the sun. But Vincent, for almost the first time in his life, decided to cheat. Oh, what a nightmare, he said to Albert in English. He understood, but not well. What happened? He asked. The guileless pirate's face was immediately contorted with fear. He was more worried about the condition of the boat than he was about his own life. Look, Vince said, poking at the switch box. This thing could catch fire at any moment. Look how hot it's getting. We need to change something right away. Where to? Albert was surprised. His hand involuntarily went to the holster on his belt. Big Boss didn't say to touch anything, just to see. Relax. The sailor hastened to reassure him. There's plenty of parts. We'll pick the right one and move it around. And if this thing catches fire, do you know what your boss will do to you? Albert found the argument convincing. He went upstairs with the Russian slave and was about to jump to the bridge, but he stopped. The pirate looked at Vincent and gestured forward with an obliging gesture and smiled. After you, he said. The sailor took one broad step over the obstacle and walked toward the warehouse. As he walked, he considered what to do with Albert. He couldn't raise a hand against the man, much less hurt him. Nature had given him a kind, perfectly peaceful nature, but his life depended on it. Help, he asked Albert, pointing to the top shelf. When the black pirate looked in that direction, Vincent slapped him sharply on the forehead and was surprised at his own quickness. It was a move they'd been taught at the academy, but they'd never practiced it before. It was textbook. Albert staggered. Vince picked him up so he wouldn't hit the ground and put him down, took off his gun holster and knife sheath. Then he thought about it and tied his hands and feet in his trademark nautical knot. Then he tied his mouth shut too. Overcoming fear and overriding his own conscience, Vince patted his prisoner's pockets. His cell phone, he unlocked it. According to the smartphone, the connection was excellent. At first he wanted to look at the time, but then he realized he was in December 11th. He had spent 6 months in captivity. A terrible. Then the mechanic turned on geolocation to see where he was. Whistled. It was 200 nautical knots to a relatively safe place. But if he carefully steps out on the water, turns off the transponder, and moves slowly, he may well get away. It was his only chance. When darkness fell, Vince opened the repair dock gate and started the boat's engine. Big Boss still hadn't shown up. Maybe he was waiting for a call from Albert, or maybe he'd gone out. He was the real king here, so he could have all the advantages. Vince backed up. Slowly, carefully began to pull out of the dock. He put on the small forward gear, picked a direction, and went at minimum speed. The shore was glowing with lights and looked like a harbor town from a distance. Vince was getting farther and farther away, pleased with his luck, adding speed. Why hadn't he realized this before? He knew how to drive a boat like this. It was no more difficult for him than driving a car. And when the yacht had already left the dock at a decent distance, the sailor heard shooting and noise. The voices were clearly directed at him. Vincent turned the engine to maximum and began to pray. Their apartment was unusually quiet that evening. No shouting, no swearing. Tina walked over to her mother-in-law and put her hand on her shoulder. "Or, Softiana," she said, "I'm so guilty, you have no idea." "Oh, what happened?" her mother-in-law asked. She felt a burning sense of shame herself. How quickly their perfect family was gone. "I also feel that he's alive, and that he'll be back soon." Fiona brightened. She had been wrong to doubt her grandson's mother. A good girl, just with a claim. "Faith, oh, Tina," the grandmother replied. "We've made a lot of trouble. So much we've done that we can't even clear it up in a year." "He'll come back," Tina said with conviction. I know. I can feel it." There were so many other things she wanted to say. That she would raise the money to pay off her bank debt. That she would never leave this town where she had known the joy of motherhood. And that their family would be preserved and become a model family. But a phone call brought her out of her thoughts. She looked at the phone. A long, long number, obviously foreign. Could it be that Peter had collected the money and was calling? How on earth was she going to talk to him? Be that as it may, Tina swiped the phone. "Hello," she said. "Me, Tina." Heard a familiar voice. "Tina, it's Vince." "Tina, I'm coming home. Do you hear me?"